The power pause. How silence becomes the loudest strategy. We live in a world where words are currency, where conversations often feel like competitions, and where silence is treated like a void that must be filled immediately. Yet, there's a paradox hidden in plain sight. Silence, when used deliberately, becomes the most commanding voice in the room. This concept is what I call the power pause, and though it looks like nothing on the surface, it's one of the most potent psychological levers you can pull in human interaction. The mechanics are deceptively simple. You ask a sharp question, or make a bold statement, and then you stop. You don't clarify, you don't soften the edges, you don't ramble to fill the air, you just let the silence breathe. And here's where the magic starts. The human brain is a meaning-making machine. We hate blanks, we hate uncertainty, and we absolutely hate unresolved tension. That stillness you create after your words doesn't feel neutral to the other person, it feels charged, heavy, and almost unbearable. Their mind begins racing. Why isn't he saying anything? What is she thinking? Do I need to explain myself? Did I say the wrong thing? And as that inner storm builds, they almost always break. They talk. They justify. They reveal. They open doors they never intended to open, simply because you refused to fill the silence for them. The paradox is striking. You controlled the entire exchange by seemingly doing nothing at all. Why does this work so powerfully? Think about it. In social situations, silence is rare. People scramble to fill empty space with jokes, filler words, explanations, or nervous laughter. When someone dares to remain calm, quiet, and still, the entire rhythm shifts. Silence suddenly feels like dominance. It signals, I don't need to convince you. I don't need to chase. I am comfortable enough to wait. And that calm confidence, especially in tense situations, is intimidating. It's like being across the table from a poker player who never blinks, never fidgets, and just stares at you after making a move. You start second-guessing everything, not because of what they said, but because of what they didn't. That is the power pause. What's fascinating is how the brain reacts to ambiguity. Psychologists have shown that humans crave closure. When something feels unresolved, our minds race to close the gap. Silence is unresolved by nature. It's an unfinished sentence, an unanswered question, an echo that demands a reply. And that's why it works so well. You don't have to pressure someone with more words or stronger arguments. Instead, you let the discomfort of the silence do the heavy lifting. It's not manipulation, it's space. You're creating a container where the other person's own thoughts, fears, and truths spill out. Let me give you practical examples. Imagine you're in a negotiation and the other side offers a number. Instead of reacting, instead of countering immediately, you simply look at them and stay silent. That stillness makes them wonder if they lowballed you, if you're unimpressed, or if they need to sweeten the deal. 9 times out of 10, they start talking again, sometimes giving you more than you even asked for. Or think about relationships. You ask your partner, is that really how you feel? And then pause. In that pause, the surface level answer often cracks, and the deeper truth emerges. The same goes for arguments. When you calmly say, that's not what I heard, and then stop, the other person often rushes to explain further. In all of these cases, the silence functions like a mirror. You're not pushing your perspective, you're reflecting theirs back at him, and in that reflection, truth becomes louder. But let's go deeper, because the pause isn't just about others, it's also about you. When you master silence, you master your own impulse to chase, to prove, to over-explain. Most people believe that control comes from dominating the conversation. But in reality, control comes from restraint. The pause is not weakness. It's a test of your ability to hold steady. It trains patience, sharpens presence, and forces you to embrace the discomfort that everyone else tries to avoid. And ironically, the very act of resisting that urge to fill the gap is what makes you appear more grounded, more powerful, more in control. Another way to think about it is music. The drumbeat is not just the strike, it's the echo. The pause after the note is what makes rhythm possible. If there were no spaces, music would just be noise. Communication is the same. Without pauses, our words blur together. With pauses, they become sharp, intentional, and unforgettable. Silence turns your words into strikes that actually land, because the pause amplifies them. Now, let's consider the psychology of tension. In any form, social, emotional, or physical tension seeks release. When you stretch a rubber band, eventually it snaps back. When you hold a silence after a piercing question, the other person feels that tension building inside their chest, and the easiest way to release it is to speak. They'll often spill more than they planned, because breaking silence feels safer than holding it. That's why the pause is like fishing. You don't yank the line the second you feel a tug. You wait. You let the fish tire itself out. And then, when the moment is right, you reel it in. But I need to emphasize something crucial. Silence isn't passive. It isn't about zoning out or having nothing to say. It's active, intentional, and surgical. You're not withholding words because you're empty, you're withholding because you know the other person is full. They just need the space to reveal it. And the pause is that space. That's why I call it a pressure point. It's not the strike that does the most damage, it's the silence that follows. In our culture, we glorify speed, response time, quick wit, and constant talking. The world teaches us that the fastest voice wins. But the power pause flips that logic on its head. By holding back, you take control. By saying nothing, you create the conditions where the other person says more. By embracing stillness, you unsettle them, and in that unsettled space, truth surfaces. That's why restraint doesn't feel powerful until you use it. Once you do, you realize how profoundly silence tilts the balance of power. Think of moments where silence shifted history: negotiations, courtroom testimonies, debates. Often, it's not the fiery speech that moves the needle but the perfectly timed pause that unsettles the opposition. Silence is rare, and rarity signals value. Anyone can talk endlessly, few can command silence. And when you do, people notice. So how do you use this in your life? Start small. In your next conversation, when someone finishes speaking, don't rush in with your reply. Let a beat of silence hang. Notice how they often pick it back up themselves. In negotiations, after you state your position, pause. Let them scramble to fill the space. In relationships, when emotions run high, pause. Let the silence carry more weight than your words could. It's not about manipulation, it's about giving space for what's hidden to emerge. And here's the final paradox. Silence feels uncomfortable, but only for those who fear it. When you make peace with it, when you sit calmly in that void, you shift the discomfort onto the other person. And that's when they break. That's when they reveal. That's when the mask slips. So the next time you want to uncover the truth, resist the urge to chase it. Instead, create the gap. Ask your question, make your statement, and then stop. Say nothing, because in the end, the loudest thing you can say is silence. The Benjamin Franklin effect. Why asking for help makes people like you. We usually believe that generosity is the fuel of friendship, that if we want people to like us, we should give more, help more, and serve more. It feels intuitive. The more we contribute, the more people should value us. But human psychology doesn't always play by those rules. In fact, there's a strange paradox that flips this script entirely. It's called the Benjamin Franklin effect, and it suggests that people actually grow to like you more when they do you a favor, not when you do something for them. At first glance, it sounds absurd. Why would someone feel closer to you after giving instead of receiving? But when you dig into how the mind works, it starts to make perfect sense. The story begins with Franklin himself. During his time in politics, he had a bitter rival who opposed him at every turn. Instead of fighting harder or showering him with generosity, Franklin tried something unusual. He asked the man for a small favor. He wanted to borrow a rare book from his collection. The man reluctantly agreed. Franklin thanked him and returned the book promptly. That single interaction shifted everything. The rival began treating Franklin with respect, even warmth, and eventually turned into an ally. What changed wasn't Franklin's actions of kindness, but the rival's perception of himself. He helped Franklin and then had to explain to himself why he would do such a thing. The most comfortable explanation: he must not dislike Franklin after all. This is where psychology steps in. Our brains crave internal consistency. We don't like contradictions between what we do and what we believe. So when we help someone, especially when we didn't have to, our mind scrambles for a reason. Why did I lend them that book? Why did I give them advice? Why did I take a moment for them? The easiest answer is, because I must like them. In other words, we don't only help people we like, we start liking people because we help them. That's the core paradox. But let's zoom out. Why does this matter for us today? Because most people trying to build connections rely on giving. We bring gifts, favors, attention, support. And while generosity can build goodwill, it also creates imbalance. Sometimes when we give too much, the other person feels indebted, awkward, or even resistant. Receiving too much help can make people pull away, because they don't want to feel like they owe you. But when someone helps you, the opposite happens. They feel invested. They feel a sense of agency. They start to see you as worth their effort. The trick, though, lies in scale. Ask for too much, and it feels like exploitation. A small favor, however, sneaks past defenses. It might be something as tiny as asking for an opinion, a recommendation, or a quick piece of advice. On the surface, it feels insignificant, but beneath the surface, it sparks something powerful. The moment someone gives even a little of themselves, time, thought, energy, they start to weave you into their story. They begin to rationalize. If I helped this person, then they must be worth it. If I invested in him, they must have value. That's how connection begins, not through a grand gift, but through a small request. Now, let's break down why this paradox is so psychologically rich. It hinges on what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. When our actions and beliefs don't align, our mind works overtime to resolve the tension. If I don't like someone, but I just help them, I have two choices. Either admit I contradicted myself, or adjust my feelings. Most people choose the latter. The brain smooths the gap by convincing itself, I guess I do like them. It feels more comfortable to rewrite the emotion than to live with inconsistency. There's also a deeper layer here tied to identity. When people help you, they don't just think about you, they think about themselves. They tell themselves, I'm the kind of person who helps valuable people. I'm generous with people I like. And suddenly, by simply asking for help, you're positioned as someone who fits that narrative. They begin to see you not as a burden, but as a reflection of their own values. This is why the effect is so resilient. It doesn't rely on your charm, status, or cleverness. It relies on their need to see themselves in a consistent, positive light. Think about how this shows up in everyday life. A manager who asks their team for input isn't just gathering ideas. They're giving their team a chance to feel invested. A teacher who asks students for feedback isn't just seeking opinions. They're building trust by letting students see themselves as contributors. Even in friendships, asking someone to help you move a box, lend a book, or give advice can build a bridge that pure generosity might not. Because when they say yes, they don't just give something, they give part of their identity to the relationship. This effect also explains why relationships often deepen when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. Many people fear that asking for help makes them look weak, but the opposite is true. When you open space for others to contribute, you make them feel trusted and needed. And when someone feels trusted, they begin to trust back. It's a subtle inversion. Instead of proving your worth, you allow him to prove theirs, and in doing so, they raise your value in their own eyes. Of course, the Benjamin Franklin effect isn't about manipulation. It's not about tricking people into liking you. It's about understanding how connection actually forms. Too often, we think we need to impress others by giving endlessly. But in reality, connection often comes from participation, not performance. People bond through shared investment. And the smallest request is often the doorway to that bond. The cycle it creates is self-reinforcing. You ask for a favor. They say yes. They start liking you a little more. The next time, they're more open to helping again. Each act deepens their own narrative that you're someone they value. It doesn't feel forced because it isn't forced. Their own choices convince them. You're not pushing your way in, you're letting them invite themselves in. So how do you use this in your own life? Start small and natural. Instead of bending over backwards to win approval, Try inviting people in through little requests. Could you give me your take on this? Mind helping me choose between these two? Do you know a good resource for this? These aren't burdens, they're invitations. And when people accept, they're not just helping with the task, they're cementing a bond. The beauty of this paradox is that it doesn't require force or persuasion. It only requires humility. You don't have to overgive. You don't have to impress. You just have to allow others to step forward and do something simple for you. Because in that small act, their mind rewrites the story. They helped, therefore they like. They invested, therefore you matter. And from that point forward, you're no longer a stranger, you're someone woven into their sense of self. So next time you want someone to like you, resist the urge to give more, flatter more, or perform harder. Instead, try the opposite. Ask for a little. Allow the silence after your ask. Let them choose to step in. And then watch as their own mind does the rest. That's the paradox Franklin uncovered centuries ago, and it's just as powerful today. We think affection is earned by giving, but more often than not, it's born by receiving. And that's the strange, counterintuitive, yet deeply human power of the Benjamin Franklin effect. The mirroring effect. How copying builds instant trust. We're often told to be unique, to stand out, to prove our individuality. Yet hidden inside human psychology is a paradox that flips this idea upside down. People often trust you more when you act like them. It sounds counterintuitive, but subtle mirroring, matching someone's rhythm, posture, or gestures creates a powerful sense of connection that words alone can't achieve. The more someone feels you move like them, the more their brain whispers, "This person is like me." And in that simple recognition, trust begins to form. To understand why, think about how the brain constantly scans the environment. We're wired to detect threat versus safety, stranger versus ally. One of the fastest ways the brain evaluates this is by looking for patterns and similarities. Familiarity equals safety. When someone reflects our movements back to us without us consciously noticing, it tells our nervous system, "You're not alone here. This person is in sync." That sense of sync happens in the body long before words enter the picture. Mirroring is powerful because it operates beneath awareness. If it's too obvious, it feels creepy or mocking. But when it's subtle, a posture shift a beat after theirs, a nod that lands with their pause, a similar energy in hand gestures, the effect is invisible but strong. They don't think, "You're copying me." Instead, they feel, "You get me." And that feeling builds rapport faster than a perfectly crafted sentence ever could. Consider how music works. Two instruments can only harmonize when tuned to the same key. Mirroring is that tuning. You enter their rhythm instead of forcing them into yours. It begins as soft alignment, your body reflecting theirs, your pace matching their tempo, and once harmony is established, you can guide the rhythm forward. But until you've mirrored, you can't lead. That's the paradox. Influence comes not from pushing, but from blending first. Why does this matter so much? Because human connection isn't purely logical, it's visceral. Long before people analyze what you said, they feel how you said it. The tilt of your body, the pacing of your speech, the way you hold stillness or gesture, these cues bypass conscious thought and signal either, "We're similar," or "We're different." Mirroring gently nudges the brain toward similarity, and similarity feels safe. Trust rarely comes from dazzling someone with brilliance. It often comes from letting them see themselves in you. This is why conversations flow more easily when both people fall into the same rhythm. You've probably experienced it without thinking. Sitting across from a friend, you lean back and notice a moment later they've leaned back too. Or you cross your legs, and they soon follow. These aren't rehearsed behaviors, they're instinctive acts of bonding. Skilled communicators use this instinct intentionally. By attuning themselves to the other person's rhythm, they create a silent bridge of trust that words can walk across. But here's where many get it wrong. Mirroring isn't imitation. Imitation is robotic, obvious, and usually makes the other person uncomfortable. True mirroring is delayed and nuanced, like a dance where one partner follows half a beat behind. A mirrored gesture feels natural precisely because it's imperfect. The delay says, "I'm with you," not, "I'm mocking you." The art is in subtlety. Too exact, and it feels fake. Too fast, and it feels manipulative. Just enough, and it feels like harmony. There's also an emotional layer. Real mirroring isn't just about copying motions, it's about attuning to someone's emotional state. If they're calm, your body softens. If they're animated, your energy lifts. If they speak slowly, you ease your tempo. Done well, this creates resonance, like tuning forks vibrating together. People feel seen, not because of your words, but because your body echoed their energy. And when people feel seen, trust follows naturally. Think about negotiation. If the other person is leaning forward, speaking with clipped, deliberate sentences, and you match that focus with your posture and pace, you don't have to say, "I understand you." They'll feel it. Or consider meeting someone new. Instead of trying to charm them with clever stories, simply sit the way they sit, listen with their rhythm, gesture with their energy. Without them realizing why, they'll warm up more quickly. That warmth comes not from what you said, but from how you silently aligned. The paradox of mirroring teaches us something deeper about human connection. We don't crave perfection, we crave resonance. We don't trust the flawless performer, we trust the person who reflects us back to ourselves. That's why mirroring, when done with care, becomes soft power. It doesn't shout, it doesn't dominate, it whispers, "You and I are alike." And that whisper is often louder than any speech. Some people mirror naturally without thinking. Empathetic communicators, good leaders, and great listeners often find themselves syncing with others because they're tuned in emotionally. For them, mirroring isn't mechanical, it's instinctive. But even if it doesn't come naturally, it can be practiced. Start by noticing the rhythm of others. Do they gesture quickly or slowly? Do they speak with lots of pauses or rapid bursts? Are they leaning forward with intensity or reclining with ease? Once you notice, gently adapt your own rhythm. You'll be surprised how quickly rapport deepens. Here's the beauty: the more you practice, the less it feels like copying and the more it feels like tuning in. Instead of thinking, "Now I must cross my arms," your body naturally sinks because you've trained your awareness. With time, mirroring becomes less about mechanics and more about empathy. You don't fake connection, you feel it, and your body expresses it on its own. The effect is profound because it flips influence on its head. You gain trust not by asserting yourself first, but by dissolving yourself into their rhythm. You become visible by being invisible. You gain power by surrendering. You connect not through effort, but through resonance. And once resonance is established, you can guide the interaction anywhere, because people follow those they already feel aligned with. So the next time you want to build trust, resist the urge to stand out or dominate the conversation. Instead, watch, listen, sit how they sit. Nod when they nod, match their pace, mirror their rhythm, not to manipulate, but to reflect. Connection doesn't always begin with grand gestures or brilliant words. Sometimes it begins in silence, in posture, in breath. And when you mirror just enough for their brain to say, "This person is like me," you've unlocked the fastest path to trust. That's the paradox of mirroring. You lead best by following first, and you build closeness not by being different, but by resonating in sameness. The power of naming feelings. How words calm the storm. We often assume that talking about emotions makes them bigger, that anger grows when spoken out loud or sadness deepens when it's called by name. Yet human psychology hides a paradox. The very act of naming a feeling can actually shrink it. This process, known as affect labeling, works because language doesn't just describe reality, it shapes how we experience it. When someone is lost in emotional chaos, what they need isn't to be told, "Calm down," or "Don't worry." Those phrases only dismiss their experience. What soothes the storm is recognition. A simple, quiet acknowledgement like, "You seem upset," can take an overwhelming wave of feeling and place it into a container, a shape that the mind can hold without drowning in it. That container is the name. Think of emotions as raw energy. They arrive unfiltered, messy, and often overwhelming, like smoke filling a room. In that state, it's hard to think clearly. But when someone points to the smoke and says, "That looks like fear," or "This feels like frustration," the mind gains direction. Suddenly, the chaos isn't everywhere at once. It has a label, a boundary, something that can be handled. The moment a feeling becomes warded, it shifts from pure sensation into thought, activating different parts of the brain. That shift changes the experience. What once felt like drowning becomes something you can swim through. This is why therapists, skilled communicators, and empathetic friends use affect labeling instinctively. They don't try to fix the storm. They name it. In that naming, a strange relief appears. It's not magic, it's neuroscience. Emotional overwhelm often hijacks the amygdala, the brain's alarm center. But naming triggers activity in the prefrontal cortex, the reasoning center. Like switching gears, the brain moves from chaos to clarity. Just by saying, "You sound disappointed," or "You look like you're carrying a lot," you're helping the other person find footing inside their storm. And when people feel grounded, they can breathe again. It might seem counterintuitive. We're taught that the way to help is to offer solutions, to problem solve, to cheer people up. Yet more often than not, solutions feel premature. A person in pain doesn't want a lecture. They want to feel less alone inside their feeling. The act of naming delivers that sense of recognition. It's a way of saying, "I see you. I'm with you. I'm not afraid of your emotion." And that message is far more stabilizing than any advice could ever be. Even when the label isn't precise, it still helps. If you say, "You seem anxious," and they reply, "No, it's more like I'm annoyed," the conversation still progresses. You've created a starting point. They've corrected the label, but in doing so, they've organized their own experience. The emotion has moved from formless fog into clearer definition. And definition is calming. It doesn't make the problem vanish, but it makes the problem less frightening. Imagine someone who feels like they're carrying an invisible weight. They don't want you to grab it out of their hands, they want you to notice it's there. When you say, "That seems heavy," you've already helped. You haven't solved anything. Yet the burden feels lighter because it's no longer invisible. Being seen reduces isolation, and isolation is often what makes emotions unbearable. This paradox tells us something profound about human connection. People don't need constant reassurance or positivity. They need resonance. They need to feel that what they are experiencing has been noticed and accepted. That recognition doesn't require grand speeches. It can come from a single sentence, or even a single word. Sad, overwhelmed, frustrated. These small words act like lifelines. They don't erase the ocean, but they give the person something to hold while swimming. There's a practical lesson here for everyday life. When someone close to you is upset, resist the urge to explain, distract, or minimize. Instead, pause and offer a label. If they're pacing, clenching their jaw, or falling silent, you might quietly say, "You look worried." If they're speaking with sharp intensity, you could say, "That sounds frustrating." These small observations break the spell of raw emotion because they provide structure where there was only storm. The moment the feeling has a name, the feeling softens. It works both ways too. When you're the one overwhelmed, naming your own emotion is equally powerful. Saying to yourself, "I feel anxious," or "This is sadness," turns something invisible into something visible. Once it's visible, it feels manageable. You've placed it outside of yourself enough to see it, and in that space, it loses some of its control. You don't push it away, you give it form. We might think that people want us to fix their pain, but most often, they want us to share the space inside their pain. They want acknowledgement, not dismissal. When someone says, "You seem exhausted," the message isn't just about fatigue, it's about presence. It says, "I'm looking, I'm listening, and I'm not running away." That's why labeling is so effective. It's not about the word itself, but about the deeper message carried with the word. You're not alone in what you're feeling. The paradox grows deeper. You don't reduce emotion by resisting it. You reduce it by honoring it. That honoring doesn't make the storm stronger, it makes the storm safer to stand in. People don't calm down because the problem vanished. They calm down because they are no longer invisible. The emotion becomes real, shared, and grounded. And grounded emotions don't spiral in the same way hidden ones do. Think of emotions like shadows. In the dark, they look enormous, terrifying, impossible to face. But the moment you shine a light and give them definition, they shrink. Naming is that light. It doesn't erase the shadow, but it makes the shadow less threatening. This is why affect labeling feels almost like emotional CPR. It restores breath where there was only panic. It restores balance where there was only chaos. So the next time someone near you is in distress, remember the paradox. Don't rush to solve. Don't silence the storm with optimism. Instead, offer a word. A simple, thoughtful word that names what they might be feeling. Even if it's imperfect, it's enough. Because once the emotion has a name, it becomes something they can face. And when they can face it, they can move through it. That's the strange, powerful truth of affect labeling. The smallest word can hold the heaviest weight, and naming the storm is often the first step to calming it. The door in the face effect. How rejection unlocks agreement. We're taught to avoid rejection at all costs, to be polite, measured, and reasonable when we make requests. But psychology has a curious trick. Sometimes the fastest way to get a yes is to start with a no. This is the paradox of the door in the face technique, a principle that looks like self-sabotage but in reality makes agreement more likely. It works like this. You begin by asking for something deliberately larger than what you actually want. The other person says no, as expected. Then you immediately follow up with your real request, the smaller one you actually had in mind. Suddenly, that second request feels lighter, fairer, and more acceptable, not because it changed, but because the context around it did. The contrast is what makes it persuasive. At first glance, this sounds manipulative, but it really isn't when done genuinely. It's not about tricking people. It's about how the human brain processes fairness and comparison. Imagine you ask a friend to spend their entire weekend helping you paint your house. They decline. Of course, it's too much. But when you follow up with, "No problem. Could you just help me for an hour on Saturday morning instead?" The shift is dramatic. The second request feels cooperative. It feels like compromise. It feels like relief compared to the heavier ask before it. Without realizing it, the person now feels more open to saying yes. They feel like they're meeting you halfway, even though your halfway was your actual destination all along. The underlying psychology is fascinating. When someone rejects us, a small sense of tension or guilt often lingers. People want to feel fair, they want to feel cooperative. They don't enjoy being the person who just shuts the door in someone's face. So when you return with a smaller, more reasonable ask, you're not piling on pressure, you're releasing it. They get to repair the tiny guilt of the first no with an easy yes. That yes feels good, not like a burden but like a choice they freely made. This principle has been tested in social psychology experiments again and again. Researchers found that people are far more likely to donate, volunteer, or agree to requests when those requests are framed after a larger one. The brain works through comparison. $5 feels like a lot if it's the first number on the table. But compared to $100, 5 feels like almost nothing. Nothing about the money changed, only the frame changed. This is why rejection, when controlled, becomes a persuasive tool. But here's the nuance. The first request can't be ridiculous. If you ask for $1 million and then settle for 10, it looks fake, forced, and manipulative. The effect collapses. For this to work, the big ask has to still live within the realm of possibility. Just enough that it seems like you wanted it, and just enough that the refusal feels justified. That makes the smaller ask look like a natural adjustment instead of a setup. People are smart, they can sense insincerity. The trick isn't to fake compromise, but to genuinely frame your smaller ask as part of a flexible negotiation. The paradox runs deeper. By risking rejection, you increase your chances of acceptance. Most of us avoid no because it feels personal, like failure. But in this method, no becomes part of the strategy. You actually want it. The no softens the ground for the yes. It flips rejection from a wall into a doorway. You don't stop at the slammed door, you knock again with something more reasonable. And that second knock is the one that gets answered. This isn't limited to sales or fundraising. It shows up everywhere in daily life. Parents use it with children. Can you clean your whole room and the garage today? When the child resists, the parent follows with, "All right, just clean your room." Compared to the garage and the room, the single task feels easy. Negotiators use it in business deals. They anchor high, get turned down, and then shift toward what they really wanted. Even in friendships and relationships, the technique sneaks in naturally. Ask for a full day together, get a no, then settle for coffee. And suddenly the coffee feels like an easy yes. But does this cross into manipulation? That depends on intention. If your aim is exploitation, then yes, it's manipulative. But when used as a genuine strategy for cooperation, it's actually fairer than asking small straight away. Because asking small first can sometimes make the small thing look big. If I ask you directly for 2 hours of your time, it may feel like a burden. But if I first ask for an entire weekend, and then only ask for 2 hours, suddenly those 2 hours feel generous, cooperative, even kind. Nothing changed about the 2 hours, it only changed in relation to what came before. That's the secret of the human mind. We judge everything by comparison. A glass of cold water feels icy only after touching hot metal. A dim light feels bright after darkness. The request feels light only because of what it follows. The door in the face technique doesn't alter reality, it alters the lens through which reality is judged. Here's another layer of the paradox. By starting too big, you actually make yourself look more flexible. You show that you're willing to compromise, to adjust, to negotiate. This softens the other person too. Instead of feeling pressured, they feel like they're meeting you halfway. And when people feel part of a cooperative compromise, they're more satisfied with the decision. They don't just say yes reluctantly, they say yes willingly, because it feels fair. It's like lifting weights. If I hand you a 50-pound weight first, then replace it with a 10-pound weight, the lighter one feels almost weightless, even though it's still heavy in isolation. The mind compares everything, and that comparison is the lever that makes persuasion work. This is why good communicators don't fear rejection, they walk into it on purpose, because they know what comes next. So, how can you use this in your own life without overstepping? The key is believability. Your first ask has to be just slightly beyond reasonable, not absurd. It has to be something you would have actually wanted, but can live without. And when you back down, it has to feel natural, not staged. That's what keeps it authentic. For example, if you're planning a group trip, you might say, "Could you handle all the travel arrangements?" If that gets turned down, you can follow with, "All right, maybe just handle booking the hotel then." The second request feels lighter, they feel more helpful, and you get the cooperation you needed. The paradox is this: rejection becomes the bridge to agreement. Most people fear hearing no, but those who understand this principle see no as a stepping stone. Instead of rejection being the end of the road, it becomes part of the journey to yes. That's the brilliance of the door in the face effect. You don't persuade by avoiding failure. You persuade by using failure as the setup for success. So next time you need something, don't ask small right away. Start a little bigger. Expect the door to close. And when it does, smile and ask for the real thing. You'll find that the yes comes easier, not harder. Because the human brain loves contrast, and in the game of persuasion, rejection isn't the enemy, it's the tool that opens the door. The Zeigarnik effect. Why unfinished stories hook the mind. We often assume people want complete answers, clean endings, and neatly tied up stories. But the truth is the human brain doesn't work that way. The mind latches onto the incomplete, the unresolved, the things that stop just before the finish line. This strange phenomenon has a name: the Zeigarnik effect. It suggests that unfinished tasks and stories don't fade away, they linger, humming in the background of our thoughts, demanding closure. And here's the paradox. By holding back instead of giving everything, you can create stronger engagement, deeper memory, and a far more powerful impact. Think about the last time you binge-watched a show. Why couldn't you stop? It wasn't because the story answered all your questions, it was because it kept leaving you with new ones. Cliffhangers are engineered pauses, unfinished loops designed to keep you hooked. You didn't choose to keep thinking about the next episode. Your brain did it for you. The mind hates open loops. It wants to finish what it started. That tension is what drives engagement. In a way, the most powerful storytelling tool isn't the punchline, it's the pause before it. The principle works outside entertainment too. Imagine telling a friend, "Something happened to me yesterday that completely shifted how I see things, but I'll explain later." That unfinished thread immediately locks in their attention. They may nod, but internally, their brain is waiting for resolution. You've created a mental itch they can't scratch until you choose to give the answer. It's not the information you provided that captured them, it's the gap you left behind. That's the Zeigarnik effect in action. But why does this happen? The brain is a problem-solving machine. It doesn't like gaps. When we begin a story, a task, or even a casual conversation, our mind frames it as an incomplete puzzle. Until the loop is closed, the brain keeps circling back, almost like background processing on a computer. The story someone never finished often feels heavier in memory than the one they completed. The half-written email nags louder than the one already sent. The cliffhanger lingers longer than the final scene. Incomplete equals unforgettable. Of course, this isn't just about curiosity. It's also about emotional tension. Silence, pauses, and withheld endings generate anticipation. Anticipation amplifies meaning. When the resolution finally comes, it feels more important than it really is because the brain has been waiting for it. A simple sentence can feel profound after a long pause. A modest twist can feel monumental when delayed by suspense. We often mistake the power of the ending, when in fact it was the waiting that gave it weight. Now here's the paradoxical part. You capture attention not by feeding the brain more, but by withholding. Not by flooding with detail, but by creating absence. It feels counterintuitive because we're taught to explain, to deliver, to complete. But the real trick is in restraint. Say just enough to spark curiosity, then stop. Leave the loop open. Let the silence pull them forward. That gap is where engagement lives. This principle has enormous applications. Teachers can use it in education, posing a question but delaying the answer forces students to keep thinking. Marketers use it by teasing a secret they'll reveal later, keeping audiences hooked through suspense. Even in relationships, the effect shows up. A story left mid-sentence keeps the other person leaning in, waiting for more. The Zeigarnik effect is essentially attention alchemy. It turns absence into energy, but it comes with rules. Too little information, and there's nothing for the mind to chase. Too much, and you've already satisfied the curiosity. The sweet spot is the middle where the setup is strong enough to spark interest, but the ending is withheld just long enough to sustain tension. Think of a movie trailer. The trailer doesn't reveal the whole film. It shows sparks, glimpses, stakes, and then it cuts. The cut is what makes you want more. If the trailer spoiled everything, there would be no reason to watch. If it showed nothing, you'd have no reason to care. The same works in conversation. If I tell you, there was a single moment that completely changed the meeting today, then pause, I've left a crack in the door. Your attention naturally leans in. If I had said, the meeting changed because of a funny comment someone made, it would end right there. No tension, no pull. The art lies in timing, in knowing when to hold and when to release. Now let's stretch this further. Why do unfinished tasks bother us so much? It's the same effect at work. A to-do list with unchecked boxes nags at you far louder than the things you've completed. A project half done occupies more mental real estate than one fully wrapped. The mind stores open loops like unresolved alarms, buzzing in the background. That's why people sometimes wake up thinking about an email they never finished, or a conversation they meant to have. Incompletion isn't passive, it's sticky. This is why one unfinished sentence can sometimes outlast a whole speech in memory. It's why a teacher's unsolved riddle can stick with you years after you've forgotten entire lessons. It's why silence can sometimes speak louder than words. The pause, the gap, the incompletion, these are psychological hooks, and once planted, they don't go away until resolved. But like any tool, the Zeigarnik effect only works if used carefully. Overuse it and people feel frustrated or manipulated. Hold back too long and they lose interest. Slam the door shut entirely and there's nothing to chase. The skill is in leaving the door cracked open enough to see light, closed enough to hide what's inside. You're not tricking people. You're respecting how the brain naturally works. You're giving it what it wants most, the promise of resolution. And when the resolution comes, the impact is amplified. It doesn't just land, it echoes. Because the brain has been waiting, the ending feels richer, more meaningful. A simple answer can feel like a revelation if it arrives after anticipation. That's the illusion. We think the ending itself was brilliant, but really it was the tension beforehand that inflated its power. The delay is the amplifier. So what does this mean in practical terms? It means the next time you want someone's attention, don't rush to complete the thought. Plant the seed, create the gap, and let curiosity do the work. You don't have to demand focus, you can pull it. The paradox is clear. By saying less, you make them listen more. By leaving unfinished, you make them remember longer. By pausing, you make the resolution hit harder. The Zeigarnik effect reminds us that humans are wired not just for closure, but for the hunger before closure. If you start the loop and resist the urge to close it too soon, you'll find that attention doesn't wander, it lingers. And when the end finally arrives, it will be unforgettable, not because of what it is, but because of what it resolved. That's the paradox. The unfinished moment becomes the one the mind refuses to let go. The hidden power of using someone's name. The power of a name is one of those mysteries we often overlook. At first glance, it seems so ordinary, just a label, a collection of sounds strung together. But when you hear your own name spoken by someone else, something subtle yet undeniable happens inside you. Your attention sharpens, your awareness rises, and for a moment, you feel anchored in the conversation. This effect isn't accidental. It's not just language, it's recognition. Names carry meaning far beyond letters and syllables. They tie directly into our identity, the one thing we carry from birth until death. And because of this, when someone addresses us by name, it feels personal, almost intimate. Psychologists and neuroscientists have explored this phenomenon for decades. Brain scans even reveal that hearing your own name activates networks linked to self-representation and emotional significance. In other words, our names literally light up the brain. This explains why a simple, "Thanks, Michael," feels warmer than a plain, "Thanks." One adds personalization, the other feels generic. The difference is so small it almost seems trivial, yet the impact can be profound. Think of a time when someone remembered your name after only meeting you once. That moment sticks. You probably thought, "Wow, they noticed me." On the surface, it's just memory. But underneath, it communicates, you matter. And when people feel they matter, they open up, they engage, and they remember you in return. What fascinates me is how this dynamic plays out in everyday life. Sales professionals, for example, deliberately weave names into conversations, not as manipulation, but because it fosters trust. Teachers use students' names to keep attention and signal care. Leaders call their team members by name because it transforms authority into connection. And yet, the paradox is that the name itself doesn't belong to the speaker. It belongs to the listener. By using it, you're borrowing something personal and returning it wrapped in acknowledgement. That tiny act is what makes it so powerful. I've seen how even in conflict, this works. Imagine saying, "I get your point, David," versus just, "I get your point." The first softens the edges. It feels like respect, even if disagreement remains. This is why skilled negotiators rely on it. It humanizes opposition. On the flip side, when names are forgotten, mispronounced, or ignored, the opposite effect occurs. We feel invisible, dismissed, overlooked. That's how much weight this seemingly ordinary word carries. And this weight isn't about flattery. It's not about showering people with compliments or crafting elaborate lines. It's simply about recognition, about making someone feel like they are the center of a moment. I often think of it like music. A conversation can flow beautifully, but when you insert someone's name at the right time, it acts like a chord change. It sharpens attention, renews emotion, and makes the listener feel the song was written just for them. The beauty of it is how effortless it is. You don't need to be charismatic. You don't need to deliver perfect lines. You only need to notice, and then acknowledge, by saying what already belongs to the person, their name. That's why I call it invisible influence. It doesn't announce itself. People don't walk away thinking, "Oh, they said my name 3 times. Instead, they leave the conversation with a subtle impression, that person really paid attention to me. And that impression can last long after the words fade. This is also where many people underestimate the practice. They assume power in conversations comes from complexity, from intelligence, from impressive vocabulary, from wit. But the truth is, real power lies in simplicity. The most ordinary word, when directed with care, can carry the most extraordinary weight. I think about this in terms of human craving. At our core, what do we all want? Not just to be heard, but to be recognized. To feel that we are seen as individuals, not faceless participants in someone else's agenda. Using a name does exactly that. It tells the other person, you're not just anyone here. You're you. That's why the technique shows up everywhere: business, education, leadership, even parenting. Parents instinctively use their children's names to ground them, to teach them, to guide them. Lovers use each other's names to express tenderness. Even in storytelling, names carry mythical significance. Characters become unforgettable not because of their actions alone, but because their names are etched into memory. Imagine Harry Potter without the name Harry. Imagine Darth Vader without that sharp, commanding identity. Names make the abstract tangible. They hold weight beyond the stories themselves. Of course, like any tool, balance matters. Overusing someone's name can feel artificial, almost like a sales script. That's why intention matters. The goal is not to sprinkle a name mechanically in every sentence, but to weave it naturally, at key points, once at the beginning to establish presence, once in the middle to re-engage, once at the end to close warmly. It doesn't need to be constant to be powerful. In fact, subtlety enhances its impact. And here's another paradox. Though we think we're making the other person feel special, in reality, we're the ones who become memorable. They may not recall every detail of the conversation, but they'll recall how you made him feel important. And that memory attaches not to your words, but to you. That's influence at its most human level. It's reciprocity without calculation. You lift someone by acknowledging their identity, and in return, they lift you in their trust, their openness, their willingness to connect. What fascinates me most is that this power is accessible to everyone. You don't need status, wealth, or charisma. All you need is to speak a word that already exists. The smallest gesture, the simplest recognition, can open doors that effort alone cannot. That's why I call it the paradox of name power. The smallest word makes the biggest difference. The ordinary becomes extraordinary, not through complexity, but through intention. And when you master this, you don't just talk to people, you connect with them. You don't just communicate, you resonate. And resonance, unlike information, lingers. People may forget your clever lines, your brilliant facts, or your polished delivery. But they won't forget how they felt in your presence. And often, what made him feel that way was nothing more than hearing their own name, spoken by you, with warmth and recognition. That's the paradox, and that's the secret. The best way to be remembered is not to keep saying your own name, it's to say theirs. The spotlight effect. Why nobody's watching as closely as you think. We live our lives often imagining that we're on stage, as if some invisible audience is constantly watching and judging our every move. You trip over a word in conversation and immediately think everyone caught it. You spill a little coffee on your shirt and you're convinced the whole office is silently laughing. This is what psychologists call the spotlight effect, and it's one of the strangest paradoxes of perception. In your mind, the lights are bright, the cameras are rolling, and every mistake you make feels amplified. But in reality, the truth is much less dramatic. Most people aren't paying anywhere near as much attention to you as you imagine. They are too preoccupied with their own insecurities, their own problems, their own fears of judgment. What feels like a stage with you under the spotlight is, more often than not, just an ordinary room filled with people distracted by their own inner dialogue. I find this fascinating because it says so much about human psychology. Our brains evolved to make us hyper-aware of how others perceive us, because once upon a time, being accepted by the group could mean the difference between survival and isolation. That ancient wiring lingers today, which is why your heart pounds when you say the wrong thing in a meeting, even though your co-workers are probably too busy thinking about their own presentations to care. The spotlight effect isn't just about embarrassment, it's also about perspective. When you realize how little attention others are devoting to your every move, you free yourself from the illusion that you're constantly being judged. I've noticed this in myself. Moments that felt humiliating to me were barely remembered by others. I once mispronounced a word in front of a large group and thought about it for weeks, but when I asked a friend about that day later, they had no idea what I was talking about. To me, it was center stage. To them, it didn't even register. That's the paradox. Your world feels magnified inside your own mind, but to others, you're just one more person in the flow of their busy lives. What's powerful about this realization is that it shifts your sense of freedom. Imagine walking into a crowded room. You feel nervous, thinking everyone is noticing your appearance, your clothes, your posture. But if you could somehow peek into their minds, you'd find most people are worrying about themselves, how they look, how they sound, what impression they're making. The spotlight you think is on you is actually diffused, scattered across hundreds of other self-focused beams. This knowledge can be life-changing. If you've ever avoided speaking up in class, or hesitated to share an idea at work because you feared ridicule, the spotlight effect explains why you shouldn't let that stop you. The truth is, people are not cataloging your every flaw. They're forgetting most of your words within minutes because they're occupied with their own. Even when you make an obvious mistake, it rarely leaves a lasting mark on anyone else. Think back to a time someone else embarrassed themselves in front of you. Did you dwell on it for days? Did you replay it over and over in your head? Probably not. You likely moved on almost instantly. And yet, when you're the one making the mistake, you imagine everyone is replaying it endlessly. That's the illusion of the spotlight at work. The deeper paradox is that once you realize nobody is watching you as closely as you think, you gain confidence. You can speak more freely, act more authentically, and worry less about appearing perfect. And ironically, this makes you more appealing, because people are drawn to confidence and authenticity. The less you're trapped by imaginary judgment, the more relaxed and engaging you become. But let's be clear, this doesn't mean you should ignore social cues or stop caring altogether. Awareness of how you come across still matters. What changes is your relationship with that awareness. Instead of being paralyzed by fear of attention, you learn to hold it lightly, knowing that most of the pressure you feel is self-generated. The spotlight effect also teaches us empathy. Next time you see someone stumbling over their words or looking flustered, remember they might feel like the whole room is staring. You have the opportunity to ease that burden simply by not amplifying it. Offer a smile, move on quickly, let them know it's no big deal because to you, it really isn't. To them, though, that small gesture may dissolve the illusion of being trapped in the spotlight. Another layer to this paradox is how it shifts our priorities. If nobody's watching as closely as we think, then why waste so much energy perfecting our image? Why stress over minor mistakes that others won't even recall? Realizing this allows you to reclaim energy for more meaningful things: creating, connecting, learning, living. The spotlight effect isn't just a psychological curiosity, it's a liberating truth. It tells us that the prison of self-consciousness is built from thin air, from assumptions that others care far more about us than they do. When you drop that assumption, you gain a kind of freedom most people never taste. You realize you can step onto your own stage, not because others are watching, but because you want to perform. You can share your thoughts not because you fear judgment, but because your ideas deserve space. The paradox of the spotlight effect is simple yet profound. In your mind, you are the star of the show, but in reality, everyone else is too busy starring in their own. That doesn't diminish you, it liberates you. It means your mistakes are smaller than you think, your embarrassments are lighter than you fear, and your freedom to act is greater than you realize. So the next time you feel the heat of the spotlight, remind yourself, the lights aren't as bright as they seem. And in that dimmer light, you'll find room to breathe, room to act, and room to live with more courage than you thought possible. The illusory truth effect. How repetition turns lies into belief. We like to think of ourselves as rational beings, guided by facts, reason, and evidence. If something is true, we believe it. If it's false, we reject it. But human psychology rarely plays by such clean rules. There's a strange quirk in the way our minds work. The more often we hear something, the more believable it feels, regardless of whether it's true. This is the illusory truth effect, and it's a paradox that explains why lies can spread like wildfire, why myths persist for centuries, and why the voice in your own head can become your harshest critic or your strongest ally depending on what it repeats. At its core, the effect is about familiarity. The brain is built to conserve energy, to take shortcuts wherever it can. One of the biggest shortcuts is assuming that if you've encountered something often, it must carry weight. Familiarity feels safe, and safe often gets confused with true. Imagine hearing a rumor once it sounds questionable. Hear it 10 times, even from different people who don't fact-check it, and suddenly it feels harder to dismiss. Not because the logic improved, but because your brain has heard it so often that it relaxes its guard. That relaxation is the danger. Repetition doesn't change reality, but it does change perception. And perception is powerful enough to shape beliefs, identities, and decisions. Think about the phrases that echo in your own mind. If you grew up hearing, "You'll never succeed," or "You're not smart enough," those words may have carved deep grooves into your thinking. Even if they were lies, repetition gave them weight. And eventually, they became part of your reality. Now flip the script. Imagine repeating to yourself daily, "I'm capable. I learn quickly. I can improve." At first, it may feel hollow, even fake. But over time, the familiarity builds comfort, and comfort turns into belief. That's the paradox. The mind doesn't necessarily reward truth, it rewards consistency. I've seen this effect play out in surprising ways. Political campaigns recycle the same slogans endlessly, not because they lack creativity, but because they know the brain eats repetition. Advertisers hammer the same jingles and catchphrases into your head until you can't help but recall them. Even urban legends endure, not because they're plausible, but because they're retold often enough to stick. The more you hear something, the more your brain treats it like background music. It fades in as normal, unquestioned. The illusion is that we're choosing what to believe, when in reality, what we hear most often seeps in beneath awareness. That's why falsehoods repeated online can feel as persuasive as facts, and why entire societies can cling to ideas that have little basis in evidence. But this isn't just about manipulation. The same mechanism can be used as a tool for growth. Athletes use mantras, therapists encourage affirmations, spiritual traditions rely on repeated chants. Why? Because repetition reprograms belief. It doesn't matter if you're whispering scripture, a positive mantra, or a daily reminder of your worth. If you say it enough times, it takes root. The effect cuts both ways, and that's what makes it so paradoxical. The same psychological bias that makes people vulnerable to propaganda also gives them the power to reshape their self-image. Let me illustrate with a personal example. There was a time when I struggled with public speaking. My inner dialogue was brutal. "You're going to mess this up. Everyone can tell you're nervous." That voice repeated so often that I believed it. It wasn't truth. It was conditioning. Eventually, I experimented with flipping the script. Before speaking, I repeated, "You've prepared for this. People want to hear what you have to say. You're good at this." The first dozen times, it felt forced. But after months of repetition, something shifted. The fear didn't vanish, but my brain had heard the opposite message enough times that it started to accept it. That's the illusory truth effect working in my favor. And here's where it gets even more practical. If you want to change what you believe about yourself, about your future, about what's possible, you don't need an overnight breakthrough. You need repetition. Pick a phrase that aligns with the truth you want to embody and repeat it until your brain stops arguing with it. It's the same process that built your self-doubt, only now you're using it intentionally. But awareness is crucial, because if you don't take control of the repetitions in your life, someone else will. The news cycle, social media, advertising, even well-meaning friends and family, all of them are repeating messages daily. Some of those messages might be lies. Some might be limiting beliefs. And if you passively absorb them, your brain will eventually treat them as fact. The responsibility then is to curate the voices you allow on repeat. Ask yourself, what do I hear most often? Do those words strengthen me or weaken me? Do they build truth or blur it? Because the mind doesn't distinguish between positive or negative when it comes to familiarity. It only counts the frequency. If the voice you hear most often says, "You're not enough," that repetition will carve deep ruts. If the voice says, "You're more capable than you realize," that becomes the groove instead. It's not about truth versus lies. It's about which echoes dominate your inner landscape. And the strangest part is how invisible this process feels. You don't wake up one day and consciously decide, "I believe this now." Belief sneaks in quietly, like water wearing down stone. Familiarity is the slow drip that shapes thought, unnoticed until the shape is permanent. The paradox is both empowering and terrifying. On one hand, it explains why propaganda, slogans, and rumors work so effectively. On the other, it gives you the tool to rewrite your internal narrative. If lies can become believable through repetition, so can new truths you choose for yourself. That's why affirmations, journaling, and daily reminders are not fluffy self-help cliches, they're rewiring exercises for the brain. They don't work by magic. They work by familiarity. And over time, that familiarity becomes belief. The danger is clear. Repetition can turn fiction into false certainty. The opportunity is equally clear. Repetition can turn chosen truths into lived reality. Either way, the brain plays by the same rules. It doesn't care whether what it hears is fact or fiction. It only cares how often it hears it. And that's why the illusory truth effect isn't just a curiosity, it's a compass for living. It tells you that what you feed your mind today will shape what you believe tomorrow. It warns you that lies repeated enough will masquerade as truth. And it reminds you that if you want to believe in yourself, in your worth, in your future, you must repeat those messages until they stop sounding strange and start sounding natural. Because eventually, they will. The lie that held you down was built by repetition. The truth that frees you is built the same way. And the choice of which to repeat, that's always yours. The yes ladder. How small agreements lead to big decisions. We often imagine that persuasion is about the strength of arguments, the power of logic, or the depth of evidence. But in reality, human psychology is often less about rational thinking and more about patterns of behavior that unfold beneath awareness. One of the strangest and most powerful of these patterns is what psychologists call the yes ladder. At first glance, it seems too simple to be real. Get someone to say yes to a few small, easy questions, and suddenly they're more likely to say yes to a bigger request. Yet time and again, research and experience show that this technique works, not because of logic but because of momentum. The brain is wired to value consistency. Once we start down a path, we prefer to keep walking rather than suddenly turn back. If you've already said yes 3 times in a row, saying no on the 4th feels like breaking a rhythm. That rhythm is subtle but powerful, and it's what turns small agreements into bigger ones. To understand why this works, consider how humans navigate social interactions. We crave harmony, and one of the simplest forms of harmony is agreement. When you agree with someone even about something trivial, you're creating alignment, and that alignment feels good. Now imagine you're asked 3 simple questions. It's a warm day, isn't it? You enjoy listening to music, right? You like saving money when you can, don't you? None of these questions require effort or risk. They're practically automatic yeses. But what happens next is the real trick. When the 4th question arrives, the one that actually matters, you're already leaning toward agreement, not because you analyzed it, but because your brain has been nudged into a flow. That flow is why the yes ladder works better than direct persuasion. Instead of facing resistance with arguments, you gently lower the guard by creating a pattern of affirmation. It's like tapping your foot to a rhythm. Once it starts, it wants to continue. I've seen this happen countless times, even in everyday life. Salespeople use it constantly. They don't start with, "Do you want to buy this expensive product?" They start with easy agreements. You care about quality, right? You like getting good value. You want something that lasts. By the time the price tag comes up, the customer is already nodding along. Politicians do it in speeches too. They begin with statements no one would disagree with. We all want a better future. We all care about our families. We all want safer communities. Each yes builds rapport, so that when the policy proposal arrives, it feels like a continuation of agreement rather than a demand for it. But this isn't just a tool of manipulation. It's also a mirror of how our own minds work. We persuade ourselves the same way. Every time you tell yourself, I can't do this, and you silently agree, you're climbing a yes ladder towards self-doubt. Each inner yes reinforces the next, until your mindset has been shaped by repetition. Flip it around, and the same mechanism can transform your outlook. If you start saying yes to small self-affirmations, I'm learning, I'm improving, I'm more capable than I thought, those yeses accumulate, and soon your brain feels pulled toward bigger affirmations. It's not magic, it's momentum. What fascinates me most is how unconscious this process is. People don't realize they're being guided. The yeses feel like their own decisions, and technically they are, but they're decisions made inside a rhythm that was set up for them. This is why skillful communicators approach difficult conversations gradually. If you start with a hard ask, resistance spikes immediately. But if you warm up with common ground, you create a sense of partnership. Agreement becomes a habit, and breaking that habit feels uncomfortable. That's the paradox. Saying yes doesn't just reflect agreement, it creates it. The act of nodding builds connection, even if the early questions are irrelevant to the final one. It's like joining a dance. Once you're in step, you don't want to stumble out. But there's an important caveat. The yes ladder only works if it feels natural. If the sequence is too obvious, if the questions come too quickly, the effect collapses. Humans are sensitive to insincerity. A forced rhythm feels like manipulation, and instead of leaning in, people pull back. The real magic lies in flow, not in force. The agreement should feel like conversation, not strategy. When used well, the yes ladder can transform tense negotiations, soften disagreements, and even deepen relationships. Imagine sitting across from someone you're at odds with. Instead of launching into conflict, you start with shared truths. We both want this to be fair, don't we? We both want to find a solution, right? We've already made some progress together, haven't we? Each yes is a step away from opposition and a step toward collaboration. By the time you reach the real issue, the mood has shifted from adversarial to cooperative. Agreement builds trust, and trust changes everything. Now, here's where it gets interesting. This effect doesn't just shape outcomes between people. It reshapes us internally. Saying yes repeatedly conditions the brain to expect openness, to assume alignment, to soften resistance. It's like training your own mind to be more receptive. That's why self-development practices often emphasize positive affirmations. They're not about tricking yourself into belief. They're about using the yes ladder on your own psyche. Each yes chips away at resistance until the new belief feels natural. Of course, like any psychological tool, the yes ladder can be abused. It can be used to manipulate, to sell things people don't need, to nudge people toward choices that don't serve them. That's the danger, but it can also be used ethically, to foster connection, to reduce conflict, to build confidence. The same mechanism works either way, because the brain doesn't judge intent, it just follows rhythm. The challenge, then, is to recognize when it's being used on you and to choose carefully how you use it on others. Ask yourself, who is guiding my yeses? Am I agreeing because it's true, or because I've been nudged into a pattern? And more importantly, what patterns am I creating in my own mind? Am I building ladders toward doubt, or toward strength? The paradox is clear. Yes doesn't just describe agreement, it creates momentum. And momentum, once set in motion, is hard to stop. The next time you want to persuade, or even just to encourage yourself, don't start with the big leap. Start with the small steps, the easy nods, the moments of shared truth. Build the rhythm first, then let the rhythm carry the weight. Because sometimes, the most powerful yes isn't the one you push for, it's the one that grows naturally out of all the little yeses that came before. That's the strange beauty of the yes ladder. It's not about force. It's about flow, and once the flow begins, it can carry you much further than logic alone ever could. The advice paradox. Why asking for guidance builds connection. It's strange how two questions that sound almost identical can create completely different reactions. On the surface, asking for someone's opinion and asking for their advice seem like the same thing. You're seeking input, you're showing interest, you're opening the floor. But human psychology works in subtle ways, and in this case, the difference in wording completely changes the outcome. The paradox is this: asking for opinions often builds walls, while asking for advice opens doors. When you ask someone for their opinion, you're essentially asking them to judge. You're inviting them to evaluate, to weigh, to critique. And once judgment enters the conversation, so does the possibility of conflict. The other person begins scanning for flaws or positioning themselves in relation to your idea. They start thinking in terms of approval or disapproval, right or wrong, yes or no. This creates distance because evaluation is inherently comparative: you versus the idea, you versus them, your approach versus theirs. It places them in the role of critic, and critics don't naturally feel close to the performer. But shift the question slightly: can I get your advice? And everything transforms. Now you're not asking them to judge, you're asking them to help. Helping brings out pride, warmth, and generosity. People feel respected when you ask for guidance, as though you've acknowledged their experience and wisdom. Instead of standing outside the conversation evaluating, they step inside it with you, collaborating. That's why advice fosters connection. It makes people feel valued rather than tested. I've seen this play out in leadership. A manager who asks their team, "What's your opinion on this strategy?" often gets cautious, fragmented answers. The team members don't want to look wrong. They don't want their opinion judged. But if the manager instead says, "What advice would you give me to strengthen this plan?" the whole mood shifts. Suddenly the team feels safe to contribute. They're not being asked to pass judgment but to add something useful. And once they've given advice, they feel partial ownership of the plan. They're invested in seeing it succeed. That's one of the hidden superpowers of asking for advice. It creates co-authors. People defend what they've helped build. This doesn't just apply to business. It's just as powerful in personal relationships. Imagine you're sharing a project with a friend. If you ask, "What's your opinion of it?" you may unintentionally trigger their inner critic. They may focus on what doesn't work, even if they like it overall. But if you say, "What advice would you give me to improve it?" their focus shifts. Now they're looking for ways to support you, not ways to measure you. They lean in with encouragement, offering suggestions rather than judgments, and that subtle difference deepens the bond. This pattern even shows up in conflicts. When we're upset, we often demand to know someone's opinion of what went wrong. But that puts them on the defensive. If instead you say, "What advice would you give me to understand your perspective better?" the tone immediately softens. They're not defending themselves anymore. They're guiding you. It reframes the conflict as a problem you're solving together rather than a battle of opinions. That's why I think this paradox deserves more attention. Advice lowers barriers, opinions raise them. Another interesting angle is how asking for advice changes how people feel about you. Most of us assume that asking for advice makes us appear less competent, as though we're admitting weakness. But research shows the opposite. When you ask someone for advice, they tend to like you more. Why? Because you've made him feel wise. You've placed them in the role of mentor, and people love that feeling. They start associating you with their own sense of importance. You become the person who brought out their best self. It's not manipulation, it's recognition. You're saying, "I trust you. I respect your perspective." That's a gift, and most people respond to it warmly. But it's important to note that this only works if it's genuine. If you ask for advice with no intention of listening, people sense it. Authenticity is key. You don't even have to follow the advice. You just have to honor it, to show that it was heard. The gesture itself carries weight, even if the outcome doesn't change. What I find fascinating is how this small linguistic tweak, opinion versus advice, reveals so much about human psychology. Opinion is about judgment, separation, and performance. Advice is about collaboration, guidance, and connection. One places people in opposition, the other puts them on your side. It's the same difference between a critic in the audience and a coach on the sidelines. Both are watching, but one is rooting for you while the other is evaluating you. And here's the paradox within the paradox. Asking for advice gives away some control, but in doing so, you actually gain more influence. People are more likely to support an idea they've contributed to than one they were merely asked to approve. By giving them a role in shaping the outcome, you earn their buy-in without ever needing to persuade them outright. This lesson has practical uses everywhere. In negotiations, instead of asking, "What's your opinion on this deal?" try, "What advice would you give me to make this work better for both of us?" In sales, replace, "Do you like this product?" with, "How would you suggest I use this to solve your problem?" In relationships, instead of, "Do you think I handled that right?" ask, "What advice would you give me for handling it better next time?" Each version steers the mind toward partnership instead of evaluation. The results speak for themselves. Advice fosters warmth, trust, and collaboration. Opinions often trigger hesitation, criticism, and resistance. And yet most people default to the opinion question without realizing how different it feels. The good news is, once you recognize the distinction, you can use it to shift conversations in your favor. You can create more openness, reduce tension, and build stronger connections simply by reframing your request. So the next time you want someone on your side, resist the urge to ask for their opinion. Instead, invite him to guide you. Give them the chance to feel wise, helpful, and respected. And then watch how the relationship changes. The paradox is simple. Asking for advice may feel like lowering yourself, but it actually elevates the relationship. It's not about making yourself smaller, it's about making space for the other person to shine. And when they shine, some of that light inevitably reflects back on you. The silent power of eye contact. How stillness speaks louder than words. There is a fascinating paradox in human interaction. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. We often believe persuasion comes from carefully chosen words, eloquent speeches, or passionate delivery. Yet the truth is, much of our influence comes from what we don't say. Strategic silence, paired with intentional eye contact, can carry more weight than entire speeches. A steady gaze, just a fraction longer than what most people expect, communicates certainty, sincerity, and presence. It's as if the eyes have their own language, one that bypasses logic and cuts straight to emotion. Most of us underestimate how much impact lies in a second of stillness. Think about it. We spend so much energy trying to polish our arguments, rehearse our lines, and fine-tune our delivery. But the people listening rarely remember the exact words. What they remember is how we made him feel. And eye contact, when done right, makes people feel seen. It creates an invisible thread between you and them, a bond that tells them, "I am here with you, and I mean this." That's what creates trust. That's what makes the message linger. Eye contact doesn't just work on others, it works on you, too. Holding someone's gaze shifts your own psychology. Suddenly, you feel steadier, more grounded, more like you belong in the moment. In fact, even if you walk into a room feeling uncertain, the act of keeping eye contact transforms your posture and presence. It projects confidence before you even feel it, and soon enough, your emotions catch up to your actions. This is one of the strange secrets of human behavior. Sometimes we grow into confidence not by thinking differently but by acting differently. When your eyes don't dart away, when you stay, you're telling both yourself and the other person, "I can handle this." And that message is contagious. People start to believe it, too. But this power is delicate. Too little eye contact, and you appear unsure or distracted. Too much, and it turns uncomfortable, even intimidating. The magic lies in a subtle extension just long enough to be felt, not long enough to become awkward. That half-second pause communicates conviction without aggression. It's like underlining your words with presence instead of volume. We can see this clearly in public speaking. The most memorable leaders and communicators don't just rely on vocal energy, they rely on silence. They pause after important lines and let the gaze settle. Those seconds of quiet aren't empty, they're loaded. They allow the audience to absorb the weight of the message. The pause says, "This matters." And the eyes anchor it so it cannot be ignored. That's why audiences often remember how a speaker looked at them more vividly than the content itself. It's not about staring down a crowd, it's about staying still, calm, and steady, giving the audience the sense that you are entirely present. Eye contact also plays an extraordinary role in relationships. Think of conversations with close friends or loved ones. The most meaningful moments often happen not in the words but in the silences between them. A steady look communicates empathy, honesty, or care in a way that no sentence can replicate. Even in conflict, the choice to hold eye contact rather than look away changes the emotional landscape. You're not dodging, you're not escalating, you're staying. That staying communicates respect. It signals, I'm not running from this conversation. I'm willing to stay in it with you. That alone can turn confrontation into dialogue. The paradox is that by doing less, no raised voice, no extra explanations, you actually do more. Stillness amplifies presence. In negotiations, this is especially powerful. Imagine making a proposal and then simply holding eye contact, silent, calm, waiting. That moment of stillness shifts the pressure to the other side. They begin to respond not just to your words but to your confidence in them. Silence becomes leverage. The same applies in leadership. A leader who speaks and immediately looks away seems uncertain, as if they don't stand by their words. A leader who lands their message with eye contact, then pauses, communicates authority without ever needing to force it. That's why the best leaders don't scatter their eyes around the room when saying something meaningful. They anchor, they hold, and they let the weight of the message settle. The interesting thing about eye contact is that it bypasses rational evaluation. People don't consciously think, they looked for 2 seconds longer, so I should trust them. Instead, they feel something, a presence, a pull, a pause that resonates emotionally. And emotions are what move people far more than logic ever will. That's why eye contact, more than words, becomes memorable. People might forget the details of what you said, but they will remember how your gaze made him feel seen, valued, respected, or sometimes challenged. That memory lingers long after the conversation is over. But there's also a responsibility here. Eye contact is powerful, and like all forms of power, it can be misused. Aggressive, unrelenting stares don't build connection, they breed discomfort. Distracted, darting glances don't build trust, they erode it. The balance is everything. True presence isn't about dominating someone with your gaze, it's about staying open, steady, and human. It's about communicating that you are there with them, not above them. In our modern world, filled with distractions, eye contact is almost rare. People check their phones, glance around, multitask while talking. That's why, when someone actually gives you full attention and holds it, it feels extraordinary. It feels intimate. It feels unforgettable. That's the paradox. The simplest act, a second of silence, a moment of looking into someone's eyes, can create the deepest impression. You don't need to over-explain. You don't need to repeat yourself. You don't need to raise your voice. You just need to let your eyes carry what your words don't need to. So the next time you want your message to land, don't rush. Don't scramble to fill every pause with sound. Say your point, then let the silence work for you. Hold the gaze. Let it linger just enough to be felt. That's where authority lives. That's where sincerity shines. And that's where power speaks without ever making a sound. The power of slow speech. Why speaking less makes you sound smarter. We live in a world where speed is often confused with intelligence. People assume that the faster you talk, the sharper you must be, the more knowledge you must hold, the more authority you command. But here's the paradox. In communication, speed is rarely power. In fact, the opposite is true. When you slow your voice, when you allow silence to settle, when you give your words breathing room, you project strength, wisdom, and calm far more than someone racing to get every thought out. And this isn't just a trick of perception, it's rooted in psychology. Our brains don't process fast streams of language as deeply. When speech races ahead, the listener falls behind, and instead of leaning in, they tune out. Fast talking feels like pressure. It feels like salesmanship, performance, even anxiety. Slow talking, though, feels like certainty. It says, I believe this so much that I'm not afraid to let it hang in the air. That's why some of the most influential figures in history were masters of timing. Think of leaders delivering speeches that linger in memory for decades. Rarely are they fast. They use rhythm. They use silence. They know that power doesn't come from flooding the air with words, but from controlling the pace at which people receive them. Each pause is like a spotlight that tells the audience, pay attention, this matters. And the fascinating part is that you don't need to change your vocabulary or add clever phrasing. The very same sentence delivered quickly sounds ordinary. Delivered slowly, with a pause before and after, it transforms into something meaningful. It's not the language, it's the delivery. This shift doesn't just affect how others see you. It reshapes how you feel about yourself. When you speak slowly, your breathing evens out, your thoughts settle, and your own sense of composure rises. You move from reacting to the moment to guiding it. Instead of scrambling to hold attention, you create it. You set the rhythm, and others unconsciously follow. This is why slowing down is such a powerful tool in moments of pressure. Imagine being in an interview. The instinct is to talk quickly, to fill every silence, to prove you know your stuff. But the person who pauses, who speaks calmly, who gives each answer space to land, suddenly that person seems far more capable, even if the content of their answer is no different. Or take negotiations. Fast talk feels like someone trying to push a deal through. Slow talk, however, carries patience and control. It communicates that you are not desperate. And patience in negotiation often equals leverage. The paradox deepens when you realize that slowing down doesn't only change the impression you give, it also changes the emotional experience of your audience. Humans don't just listen with their ears, they listen with their nervous systems. A fast, breathless speaker passes their tension onto the listener. A slow, grounded speaker does the opposite, they lower the room's anxiety. They become an anchor in the noise. And people naturally gravitate to anchors. This effect is visible in everyday conversations, too. Think of someone who constantly interrupts, rushing to fill silence with chatter. They may be enthusiastic, but they rarely get taken seriously. Contrast that with the person who waits, who chooses their words, who leaves pauses that make others lean in. That person doesn't just speak, they hold court. And here's something even more surprising. Slowing down makes people assume you know more than you actually do. Why? Because slowness is associated with thoughtfulness. Listeners imagine that the space between your words is filled with consideration, wisdom, and intent. Fast talkers sound like they are trying to catch up to their thoughts. Slow talkers sound like they are guiding theirs. This is why in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in classrooms, the speakers remembered most are the ones who give words weight. And weight doesn't come from shouting. It doesn't come from stuffing more content into every second. It comes from space. Space between words. Space between ideas. Space where meaning can settle. This is also why comedians, though they deal in laughter, rely on timing more than anything else. The pause before a punchline is often what makes it land. The same principle applies everywhere. What you leave unsaid in a moment of silence often matters as much as what you say. But of course, balance matters. Slowing down doesn't mean dragging. It doesn't mean speaking so sluggishly that people lose interest. The magic is in moderation. Just a little slower than normal. Just enough to show that you are in control, that you are not rushed, that you are certain. The half-second pause that adds gravity, not boredom. The deliberate pace that signals confidence, not hesitation. In fact, you can test this yourself in a simple way. Take a single sentence you often say quickly, something like, "That's a good idea." Now slow it down. Add a pause before. Say it clearly, calmly. "That is a good idea." Feel the difference. The second version carries weight. It feels more sincere, more powerful, even though the words didn't change. That's the paradox in motion. Power in communication is not about adding more, but about subtracting. It's not about rushing to fill space, but letting space do some of the work. Because silence isn't empty, it's charged. And the person who is unafraid of silence shows that they are not afraid of themselves. They don't need to rush because they believe in what they're saying. And people instinctively believe in those who believe in themselves. Over time, practicing this changes how people perceive you in all areas of life. Friends may describe you as calmer. Colleagues may treat you as more authoritative. Strangers may find you more trustworthy. Not because your ideas changed, but because your pace did. And perhaps most importantly, You will feel different. You'll feel less rushed, less anxious, more steady. You'll stop chasing conversations and start guiding them. That shift alone can change relationships, careers, and opportunities. The beauty is that you don't need to overhaul your personality to do this. You just need to start small. Pick one conversation today and intentionally slow down. Pause once or twice before finishing your sentence. Notice how the room responds. Over time, these small experiments build into a habit. And that habit turns into presence. Because presence isn't about saying more, it's about being more. Being steady, being clear, being in control. And that's the strange truth. You sound smarter not because you spoke quickly, but because you gave your words the space to breathe. You seemed more powerful not because you filled the silence, but because you weren't afraid of it. The paradox is simple but profound. In speech, less is more, and slower is stronger. The scarcity paradox. Why we value things more when they're hard to get. Scarcity has a strange hold on the human mind. Something can sit ignored on a shelf for months, and the moment you hear there are only 2 left, it suddenly feels irresistible. Nothing about the object changed. It didn't become more useful, more beautiful, or more functional. What changed was our perception of its availability. This is the paradox of scarcity. The less accessible something feels, the more we want it. At first, this makes no rational sense. Logic says value is tied to quality or function, yet psychology reveals otherwise. We chase what is rare not because it's better but because it might be gone. That possibility of loss stirs something primal in us. Our ancestors lived in a world where resources were scarce, and survival often depended on acting fast before the opportunity disappeared. That wiring still drives us today. Scarcity flips our decision-making from, "Do I want this?" to, "What if I lose this?" And our brain reacts more strongly to loss than to gain. Behavioral economists call this loss aversion. Studies show people will work harder to avoid losing $100 than to gain the same $100. That imbalance explains why countdown timers, limited editions, and last chance sales are so effective. It isn't the product that compels us, it's the pressure of time and the fear of missing out. What fascinates me most is that scarcity creates urgency without improving value. A simple product becomes coveted when its supply tightens, even if yesterday nobody cared. Tickets ignored for weeks sell out the moment the website says, "Only 2 seats left." People who yawned at a product announcement months ago will line up at dawn when told it's limited edition. The psychology is clear. Urgency often outweighs actual usefulness. Scarcity doesn't upgrade the object. It upgrades the story we tell ourselves about it. And that story is emotional, not rational. It says, "If I don't act now, I'll regret it." What's even more interesting is how exclusivity multiplies this effect. It's not just about few left. It's about not everyone can have it. Membership clubs, luxury brands, even invite-only apps exploit this principle. The product may not be objectively superior, but the limited access makes people feel special, chosen, part of an inside circle. Scarcity taps into our need for status and belonging. When something is rare, owning it signals we got in before the doors closed. That feeling alone creates attachment. But here's where the paradox sharpens. Scarcity adds pressure, yet it can also backfire. Fake scarcity when companies endlessly say, "Only 5 left," or run perpetual, last chance, sales eventually erodes trust. Our brains adapt, catch on, and dismiss the urgency. For scarcity to work, it must feel authentic, even if it's strategically designed. A countdown to a genuine event, a seasonal item that truly ends, a seat that really fills up, these trigger urgency because they carry credibility. Manipulative scarcity, however, breeds resentment. People don't like being tricked into desire. This is why the best use of scarcity isn't deception but framing. You don't need to lie. You need to highlight reality. Time is always limited. Opportunities are always finite. Reminding people of that natural truth is often enough. For example, in a conversation, saying, "I won't always be available for this project," makes your time more valued. In careers, People who protect their availability often command more respect than those always accessible. The paradox applies outside of commerce. It shapes relationships, commitments, even creativity. Think about art. Part of why original paintings fetch millions is because there is only one. A digital copy may look identical, but it lacks scarcity. We don't treasure abundance, we treasure uniqueness. This explains why even artificial rarity, like NFTs, can hold value. They may not make sense logically, but scarcity isn't about logic. It's about psychology. Another layer to consider is how scarcity changes not only how much people want something but how they treat it after they get it. Research shows that people value possessions more if they were harder to obtain. The struggle itself creates meaning. Waiting in line for hours, fighting through a limited release, or securing a rare ticket makes the eventual prize feel earned. That sense of effort deepens attachment. Ironically, the same item bought without difficulty might be discarded or forgotten quickly. Scarcity doesn't just motivate purchase, it magnifies post-purchase pride. But here lies a hidden danger. When something stops being scarce, it often loses its shine. Think about a song that felt special until it was played everywhere, or a gadget that seemed magical until everyone owned one. Once abundance arrives, the illusion fades. This is why brands carefully manage supply to maintain exclusivity. Too much availability kills desire. Controlled scarcity, on the other hand, keeps the spark alive. What makes scarcity so powerful is that it doesn't require more effort, more features, or more marketing. You don't need to improve the object, you simply need to frame it as less available. Limited time, limited spots, last chance. These small shifts flip the emotional switch. They turn passive observers into active decision makers. And it's not manipulation, it's simply directing attention to a reality of life. Nothing lasts forever. Time itself is the ultimate scarcity. Our lives are proof of it. This perspective brings an even deeper reflection. Scarcity is what gives experiences meaning. A concert is special because it won't be repeated in the same way. A moment with a loved one is precious because it's fleeting. If life were infinite, moments would lose urgency. Death itself, the greatest scarcity of all, is what makes us treasure the days we have. The paradox of scarcity isn't just a marketing trick, it's a principle of existence. It explains consumer behavior, social dynamics, and even personal fulfillment. When things are abundant, we take them for granted. When they are limited, we cherish them. That applies to opportunities, relationships, time, and experiences just as much as it does to products. The lesson is clear. Scarcity shapes value more than inherent worth. And if you want people to care, don't only show them what something is, show them how rare it is, how quickly it may disappear, how fragile access might be. That framing makes ordinary things extraordinary. It transforms hesitation into action, curiosity into urgency, and ownership into pride. The paradox is simple but profound. You don't raise value by adding more, you raise it by making something less available. And in that space between abundance and absence, human desire comes alive. The power of because. How one word quietly changes everything. The word because seems too small, too ordinary to carry power, yet it unlocks compliance in a way that surprises even psychologists. Experiments in behavioral science have repeatedly shown that adding this one word to a request dramatically increases the chance of hearing yes. Imagine two scenarios. In the first, someone asks, "Can I cut in front of you in line?" You hesitate, maybe even refuse. But if the same person says, "Can I cut in front of you because I need to make a call?" you're more likely to let them. The reason itself isn't extraordinary, almost everyone has calls to make, but the presence of because changes the dynamic. This happens because humans don't only process the content of speech, we process patterns. And request plus because plus reason forms a pattern the brain recognizes as valid, even when the reason is weak. The paradox is that the structure matters more than the substance. Because creates the expectation of logic, and our minds respond to that rhythm with less resistance. Instead of analyzing deeply, we slip into automatic agreement. This shortcut works because humans crave cognitive ease. We don't want to overthink every interaction. We prefer familiar structures. When we hear because, we interpret it as a sign that the speaker has thought it through, that there's justification, that the request isn't arbitrary. And our brains reward familiarity with trust. The power of because extends beyond lines and small favors. It applies in leadership, teaching, sales, and even in self-motivation. A manager might say, I need you to finish this report, and it feels like a command. But say, I need you to finish this report because your insight helps the team move faster, and it becomes recognition. Same request, but now the employee feels valued. Parents do this instinctively. Put your jacket on sounds authoritarian. Put your jacket on because it's cold outside feels like care. Teachers, too, lean on this, explaining rules with because softens them into lessons. The pattern of justification is one of the most deeply ingrained shortcuts in human psychology. And the truth is, it doesn't always need to be a strong justification. Research by Ellen Langer at Harvard famously revealed that people waiting in line for a copier were more likely to allow someone to cut in if they said, "Can I use the machine because I need to make copies?" The reason is obvious: everyone in line needed to make copies, but the brain didn't care. It responded to the structure, not the strength of logic. That study illustrates the paradox perfectly. A weak reason still works if the structure is right. Some might call this manipulative, but in practice it's more about framing. You're not lying. You're aligning your communication with how people naturally process information. The human brain evolved to conserve energy. Analyzing every request takes effort, so shortcuts like because signal when to relax and comply. Understanding this is less about tricking others and more about communicating effectively. Consider conflict resolution. Telling someone, "I need space," can sound cold, abrupt, or rejecting. But saying, "I need space because I want to come back to this conversation with a clear head," reframes it as care rather than avoidance. The word because flips the meaning without changing the core message. The same applies in relationships. "I can't join tonight" feels like dismissal, but "I can't join tonight because I need to recharge for tomorrow" feels considerate. People aren't just hearing words. They're reading intention, and because signals thoughtfulness. Interestingly, this tiny word doesn't just influence how others respond, it shapes how we respond to ourselves. Telling yourself, "I'm going to rest," can feel like laziness. But, "I'm going to rest because I've earned recovery," turns it into self-care. Similarly, "I'm going to exercise," sounds like a chore, but "I'm going to exercise because I want to feel strong," frames it as identity. We justify actions to ourselves in the same way we justify them to others. The presence of a reason, however small, reduces internal resistance. This makes because not just a communication tool but a psychological one. It can boost motivation, reduce guilt, and solidify habits. In business, this principle is everywhere. Marketers sprinkle because in campaigns to nudge decisions. Buy now because this offer ends at midnight. Subscribe because thousands already trust us. The reason may not be earth-shattering, but it feels like closure. Humans dislike unfinished thoughts, and because completes them. It ties request to rationale, and that thread makes the message stick. What fascinates me most is how such a small shift creates such disproportionate effects. We're taught to focus on the strength of arguments, on crafting irrefutable logic. But persuasion is often less about ironclad reasoning and more about familiar rhythms. People don't want the perfect reason, they want any reason, as long as it feels like part of a pattern. And that's where the paradox tightens. The word because isn't powerful because it proves anything. It's powerful because it signals that proof is present, even if it isn't. The brain fills in the gap, gives the benefit of the doubt, and moves forward without scrutiny. But of course, there's a limit. Just as fake scarcity backfires, so does empty justification. Overuse of because with reasons that feel insulting or irrelevant will erode credibility. Saying, "I need this report finished because it's important," may sound hollow if repeated too often. For the word to maintain its power, the reason doesn't need to be brilliant, but it needs to feel at least relevant or considerate. Otherwise, the shortcut breaks. Still, the lesson is profound. We often assume persuasion is about adding more evidence, more urgency, more emphasis. But sometimes, it's about less. One small word can shift how people feel about the exact same request. It doesn't demand louder arguments. It doesn't require stronger vocabulary. It simply adds structure to the sentence and safety to the listener's mind. The paradox is that because it doesn't just follow a reason, it becomes the reason. It transforms random requests into intentional ones, cold commands into caring asks, and even self-doubt into self-belief. When you begin to notice this, you'll see it everywhere in conversations, in sales scripts, in speeches, even in your own inner dialogue. And once you use it consciously, you'll feel the subtle but undeniable difference it makes. Words shape perception, and sometimes the smallest words carry the heaviest weight. The foot in the door effect. Why small yeses unlock big agreements. The idea that the smallest yes can unlock the biggest doors sounds counterintuitive, but psychology has shown it to be true again and again. This is the principle known as the foot in the door effect, where agreeing to something minor makes someone much more likely to agree to something larger afterward. At first glance, it seems almost too simple. Ask for something so small that refusal feels unnecessary, and then once that first yes has been spoken, follow with the real request. The paradox here is that the small ask itself doesn't matter nearly as much as the act of saying yes. Once a person gives even the tiniest agreement, their brain starts creating a story about who they are: someone who helps, someone who cooperates, someone who is consistent. And once that story takes root, refusing the next request feels like breaking character. Humans crave internal consistency. We don't just want to do things, we want to see ourselves as the kind of person who does them. That self-image is fragile but also incredibly persuasive. When you say yes once, your brain begins to write a script. I am supportive. I am involved. I say yes. And because our minds prefer momentum over disruption, the second yes feels almost inevitable. It's not about persuasion by argument, it's persuasion by inertia. Psychologists Friedman and Fraser famously demonstrated this in the 1960s. They asked homeowners to put a small sticker in their window supporting safe driving. A trivial request, easy to accept. Weeks later, when asked to put a large, ugly billboard on their lawn with the same message, those who had agreed to the sticker were far more likely to accept the billboard compared to those who hadn't been asked anything before. The sticker was irrelevant, but the story it sparked, I support this cause, carried forward. That's the essence of the foot in the door paradox. What fascinates me is how this technique isn't just about manipulation, but about the psychology of self-identity. When we agree to something, we want to remain consistent with our choice because inconsistency feels uncomfortable. Refusing a larger request after agreeing to a smaller one would require us to rewrite the narrative of ourselves, and most of us would rather keep the story flowing than question it. In everyday life, this technique shows up everywhere. A charity might first ask you to sign a petition, and then later ask for a donation. A salesperson might ask if you could spare a few minutes, only to later present the full pitch. Even in relationships, it happens subtly. Someone might ask if you can give a little feedback, and once you agree, they build up to requesting more involvement. Each yes is like a stepping stone across a river. You don't leap across all at once. You cross one step at a time until you're already on the other side. What's interesting is how this plays out in leadership and negotiation. A leader who tries to push a big change all at once often meets resistance. But one who introduces a small, easy adjustment, something nearly painless, creates buy-in. Once the group has accepted that first change, the next one feels less threatening, and soon the big shift that seemed impossible at the start becomes reality. The same applies in personal habits. If you want to start exercising, don't begin with a massive routine. Start by committing to 5 minutes of movement. That small yes to yourself builds identity. I am someone who works out. And before long, the larger routine feels natural. The paradox within the paradox is that the bigger yes actually feels more authentic when it follows a smaller one. People don't just comply. They feel better about complying. They rationalize the second agreement by telling themselves, this is who I am. That's why it doesn't feel manipulative. If used well, it feels like continuity. However, there's a catch. If the initial small ask feels fake, forced, or irrelevant, the entire chain breaks. If a salesperson asks you to just sign up for free information, but it feels like bait, you resist the next request even more strongly. The first yes must be genuine and respectful, not a trick. That's why this technique, at its core, is about trust. Trust amplifies the effect, while suspicion destroys it. What fascinates me most is how much of this comes down to identity and momentum. Humans aren't purely rational creatures who weigh every decision on its merits. Instead, we rely on mental shortcuts that help us conserve effort. Saying yes once lowers the friction of saying yes again. It feels smoother, easier, less like a new decision and more like a continuation. Our brains dislike starting from scratch. We prefer to keep the story running. Think of it like rolling a ball downhill. The first push is the hardest, but once it's moving, gravity takes over. The same applies to compliance. The first yes is the push, and the second yes is momentum. We often underestimate how much that first push matters. In negotiations, starting with the big ask right away feels like dropping a heavy weight in someone's lap. It triggers defensiveness, skepticism, and resistance. But if you begin lightly, with something almost effortless to agree with, it doesn't feel like a confrontation. It feels like cooperation, and cooperation is sticky, it grows. The real paradox is that the smaller the initial request, the greater its potential power. Even a request unrelated to the bigger goal still works because it's not about logic, it's about consistency. The act of agreeing once makes agreement itself more likely, regardless of the content. That's why 1 minute of attention can turn into an hour-long conversation, one signature into financial support, one favor into lasting commitment. But this principle isn't only external, it applies internally too. When we make promises to ourselves, starting small works better than starting grand. Telling yourself, I'll meditate for 1 minute, creates more long-term change than demanding 30 minutes from day one. Because once you've begun, you want to continue. The foot in the door isn't just a persuasion trick, it's a self-motivation strategy. And here's what makes it powerful. It doesn't require pressure. You don't have to push people harder or argue better. You simply walk alongside them, step by step, until the bigger yes feels natural. The paradox is that big agreement often doesn't come from big effort. It comes from small, almost invisible beginnings that snowball into something larger. That's the real lesson of the foot in the door effect. People don't leap into agreement, they slide into it, one yes at a time. The subtle power of nodding. How silent gestures create agreement. The smallest gestures often carry the deepest influence, and one of the most underestimated is the simple act of nodding. Think about it. Moving your head up and down seems like such a basic action, something we do without thinking, yet it holds surprising psychological power. When you nod while speaking, you are silently saying yes with your body, and that non-verbal cue can quietly invite others to agree with you. The paradox is striking agreement spreads not because your argument is flawless, but because your behavior models belief before words even finish forming. Humans are wired to mirror one another, and when your body expresses affirmation, others unconsciously join in. Before they realize it, their head begins to echo yours, and once their body nods, the brain instinctively looks for reasons to justify the motion. Agreement becomes easier because the body has already rehearsed it. What makes this so powerful is that nodding operates beneath awareness. No one stops mid-conversation and says, I agree because you nodded. Instead, they simply feel more aligned, more at ease, more willing to accept your point. It works because nodding is one of the oldest universal signs of understanding and trust. Across cultures, a nod signals listening, validation, connection. When paired with spoken words, it reinforces the rhythm of certainty. The voice explains, the body confirms, and the listener experiences the two as a seamless package. Influence, in this sense, is not about pushing harder. It's about embodying agreement so convincingly that others fall into step without noticing. Consider how this shows up in leadership. A manager presenting a new idea might find employees hesitant. If the manager delivers the proposal with stillness, the words hang cold in the air. But if they speak while nodding subtly, as if already affirming agreement, the energy shifts. Employees are more likely to nod back, and that mirrored nod plants seeds of acceptance. The team doesn't feel forced, They feel carried into alignment by the natural flow of the conversation. It's subtle, but it can change the trajectory of a meeting. In psychology, this ties to the principle of embodied cognition, the idea that our physical actions shape our mental states. If you act as though you believe in something, your brain strengthens that belief. When you nod while speaking, you're not just convincing others, you're convincing yourself. Your inner voice grows more confident, your sentences gain rhythm, and the conviction in your tone deepens. That self-assurance radiates outward, and others sense it even before they process your words. In everyday life, nodding smooths interactions in countless ways. When a friend shares a personal story, nodding signals you're truly listening. That affirmation opens space for trust and honesty, which means when it's your turn to speak, your perspective will be received more openly. In negotiations, nodding while acknowledging the other side's concerns builds rapport, even before compromises are made. In teaching or mentoring, nodding while encouraging questions reassures students that curiosity is welcome. The paradox is that nodding works both ways. It strengthens relationships when you're listening and increases persuasion when you're speaking. But like any tool of influence, subtlety is everything. An exaggerated or rapid nod feels artificial, almost desperate, and people detect the inauthenticity immediately. The power lies in calm, steady nods that match the tone of your message. Done naturally, nodding disappears into the fabric of conversation, invisible but impactful. Done poorly, it breaks trust and makes you look manipulative. So the key is authenticity. Nodding should feel like an extension of your belief, not a performance. What's truly fascinating is how nodding can cause people to defend ideas they barely understood when they first agreed. Because once their head says yes, the brain scrambles to find reasons that align with the action. It's cognitive backfilling. The body acts, and the mind rationalizes afterward. That means a nod doesn't just create agreement in the moment, it encourages people to strengthen and justify that agreement later. They don't think, I nodded because of you. They think, I agreed because it felt right. And that ownership makes the agreement more durable. Even in silence, the nod has weight. Picture a conversation where someone explains their feelings, and you respond only with a gentle nod. No words, no interruptions, just the motion. That gesture alone communicates, I hear you. I respect this. I understand. In many cases, the speaker leaves feeling validated, even without a single spoken reassurance. That validation makes them more receptive later when you share your perspective. It's a quiet cycle of giving and receiving agreement, initiated with nothing but a movement of the head. Now imagine applying this intentionally. You're delivering a speech. As you reach your key points, you nod slowly. The audience doesn't just hear conviction, they see it embodied. They start nodding along, not because they analyzed your argument, but because the rhythm of your certainty carried them there. Or you're in a debate. Instead of doubling down with louder words, you stay calm, make your point, and nod subtly as though the logic is self-evident. The other person feels less combative, more inclined to consider your stance, because your body language softened the resistance that words alone might provoke. What makes the nod paradoxical is that it creates agreement before agreement exists. You demonstrate the destination, and people naturally follow, often without realizing they've taken the first step. It's persuasion without pressure, guidance without commands. That's what makes it so elegant. In a world full of noise and arguments, a nod can do what shouting cannot. It bridges people gently. But there's also a responsibility here. Using nodding manipulatively erodes trust quickly. If people sense your gestures are calculated and insincere, they will resist even more. True influence comes not from pretending to agree, but from embodying genuine conviction and empathy. When the nod aligns with authenticity, it resonates. When it doesn't, it collapses. At its best, nodding isn't just about gaining agreement, it's about creating connection. It reminds us that communication is never just about words, it's about the signals our bodies constantly send and receive. And in the simplest of signals lies enormous power. The paradox could not be clearer. By showing agreement before it exists, you invite it into existence. A nod is not just a gesture, it is a seed. Plant it carefully, and agreement grows quietly, naturally, almost invisibly. Next time you want your words to land, don't just speak them. Let your head say yes while your voice tells the story, and watch how others follow where their body has already begun to lead. The silent power of negotiation. How saying nothing wins everything. There's an invisible weapon in negotiation that almost nobody talks about, and it doesn't involve clever phrases or sharp logic. It's silence. At first glance, silence feels like weakness, like you've run out of things to say or lost control of the discussion. But here lies the paradox. The less you speak, the stronger your presence becomes. Negotiation is not really a battle of words. It's a test of patience, of who can hold the tension longer without blinking. Imagine sitting across the table from someone. You've just stated your offer. A price, a salary, a term you want. Your instincts scream at you to justify it, to soften it, to show why it's fair. But the most powerful move is to resist that urge and do nothing. Let the words echo in the air. Let the silence fill the room. That stillness transforms into a kind of pressure the other person can't ignore. Humans hate gaps in conversation. Our brains scramble to close them. And in their rush, people reveal things they never intended to. They explain, they defend, they compromise, often without being asked. That's the hidden engine of silence. It makes others speak into the void, and in doing so, they often hand you the advantage. Consider a salary negotiation. You calmly say, "I'm looking for $70,000. If you tack on extra lines, "but I'm flexible," or "I know it's a lot," you're already weakening your position. But if you stop and stay quiet, the employer feels the tension. They might glance at their notes, fidget, or stall, but eventually they fill the gap. Sometimes they'll counter higher than expected just to break the silence. Sometimes they'll reveal budget limits or timing details you wouldn't have learned otherwise. And sometimes they simply accept, because your stillness signaled certainty. Silence, then, is not absence. It's strategy. It says, "I don't need to push harder because my position already holds weight." Even when you're unsure, silence projects calm confidence, and people respond to that projection as if it were reality. What fascinates me is how universal this is. Across cultures, silence carries weight. In Japan, silence often conveys respect and thoughtfulness. In Western business, silence unsettles because we're conditioned to equate speaking with control. In both cases, silence isn't neutral, it communicates, but in a way that words cannot. It mirrors the listener's own thoughts back at him, amplifying their discomfort or reflection. This is why silence is often more persuasive than arguments. Arguments trigger resistance. If you keep talking, the other person starts preparing counterpoints. But silence leaves them with nothing to resist. Instead, they start persuading themselves, justifying your offer in their own head. And the moment someone convinces themselves, the deal sticks far more deeply than if you had pressured them into it. Think about poker players. The best ones don't chatter endlessly. They sit still, composed, unreadable. Their silence forces opponents to guess, and in guessing, they make mistakes. Negotiation works the same way. The quiet after your statement makes the other person project all kinds of possibilities onto you. Maybe you know something they don't. Maybe you have alternatives lined up. Maybe you're perfectly fine walking away. That ambiguity is leverage. To apply this skill, you need practice, because silence feels unnatural. Most people can't even last 3 seconds before jumping in to fill the void. Their nervous system interprets the pause as danger. But if you can train yourself to breathe through it, to count slowly to 5 in your head, to stay composed, you flip the script. You stop being the one reacting and start being the one others react to. That shift is the essence of control. Silence is not just useful in formal negotiations either. In personal conversations, it works just as well. Imagine asking a friend for a favor. You state your request clearly, then resist the urge to over-explain. They feel the pause and lean into it, considering more seriously. Or picture a heated argument. Instead of firing back instantly, you pause. That silence unsettles the rhythm of conflict and often leads the other person to soften their tone, revealing vulnerability. Silence is versatile. It can pressure, it can calm, it can reveal. Another overlooked aspect is how silence reflects confidence in boundaries. If you've said your piece and don't rush to explain, you're signaling, this is enough. Take it or leave it. That presence is magnetic. People respect it, even if they resist it in the moment. Over time, they come to trust someone who doesn't oversell, who doesn't fill every moment with chatter, but lets their stance breathe. The paradox, of course, is that silence feels passive but functions as active influence. By removing words, you create a stage where the other person performs. They become the actor, filling the gap, while you remain the director, shaping the scene by saying nothing. That's why silence is often described as the loudest sound in negotiation. But we need to draw a line here. Silence isn't manipulation when used ethically. It's about giving space. The goal is not to trick people into bad deals, but to allow truth and clarity to emerge without drowning it in unnecessary words. Used responsibly, silence shows respect. It demonstrates that you trust the other person to think and respond without interference. Used recklessly, it can come across as stonewalling or arrogance. The difference lies in intent and tone. What makes silence so interesting is that it also strengthens the speaker. When you hold silence after an offer, you're training your own nervous system to handle discomfort. You're teaching yourself patience, restraint, and emotional control. Those qualities matter beyond negotiation. They make you a steadier leader, a better listener, a calmer presence in conflict. Silence doesn't just influence others, it transforms you. The next time you prepare for a negotiation, don't just script your words, script your pauses. Plan when to stop, when to let the silence breathe. Practice resisting the itch to add more. Notice how others squirm, reveal, or bend under the weight of quiet. And most importantly, notice how powerful you feel when you no longer fear silence but wield it. That's the paradox of negotiation. The loudest move is often the quietest one. Influence doesn't always come from speaking more, but from knowing when to stop. Silence is not empty, it's a container, and inside that container is pressure, presence, and power. If you can master it, you'll find that saying nothing often says everything. The yes ladder: how small agreements lead to big decisions. There's a fascinating psychological trick that works not because of logic or pressure, but because of rhythm. It's called the yes ladder, and it shows how a series of small, harmless agreements can prepare someone to say yes to something much bigger. At first, it sounds almost too simple. Start with questions no one would say no to, and then gradually move toward the real request. But beneath this simplicity lies one of the strangest paradoxes in persuasion. The first yeses don't even have to mean anything. They just have to exist. Once a person begins agreeing, their brain builds momentum, and that momentum often carries them to a place they never would have gone at the beginning. Think about it. If I asked you right now, do you like getting a good deal? Your answer is obvious. Of course you do. If I followed with, would you want your life to feel easier? Again, yes. These are safe, universal questions. And yet, with each yes, you're not only responding, you're reinforcing an identity. A part of you begins to say, I'm someone who agrees with this. I'm aligned with this conversation. That identity is subtle, but powerful. Because once people define themselves a certain way, they like to stay consistent. We hate contradiction in our self-image. If I've already said yes 3 times, saying no the 4th time feels jarring, even if the 4th request is far larger. That's why the yes ladder works. You're not dragging someone forward, you're letting them walk themselves up a staircase of their own answers. By the time they reach the top, saying yes to your offer feels like the natural next step, not a leap. In sales, this can look incredibly smooth. A salesperson might begin with questions like, would you like to save money? Or, do you care about protecting what's important to you? Each answer is predictable. Each one builds comfort. Then comes the real pitch. Let me show you a system that can do exactly that. And suddenly, it doesn't feel like a pushy sales tactic, it feels like alignment. The product now looks like the obvious conclusion of everything the person already agreed with. What fascinates me most is that those first yeses don't even need to connect directly to the offer. They could be about health, safety, or convenience, broad themes almost everyone cares about. What matters is not the content but the rhythm. Once you establish a rhythm of yes, people don't want to break it. Saying no feels disruptive, even uncomfortable. This is why the yes ladder isn't about trickery, it's about creating flow. People don't feel pressured. They feel like they're following a pattern they already started. And that's exactly why it feels natural to them, even when the final request is something they might have rejected outright if it had been the first thing they heard. But here's the delicate part. The early questions have to feel authentic. If they sound like a script, if they come across as manipulative, the entire ladder collapses. Humans are quick to sense when they're being led, and the moment they suspect it's a game, they step off the path. So the secret is to blend those small yeses into genuine conversation. Think of it like building rapport. You're not setting a trap, you're finding real points of agreement. Maybe it's shared values, common goals, or simply an obvious truth. From there, the ladder builds itself. Outside of sales, this idea shows up everywhere. Parents use it with kids. Do you want to grow stronger? Do you want to do well in school? Then doing your homework makes sense, doesn't it? Leaders use it in meetings. Do we all want the company to grow? Do we agree stability matters? Then investing here feels like the right move. Even in relationships, it shows up. Do you want us to be happy? Do you want our future to be secure? Then let's make this choice together. In each case, the ladder doesn't force compliance. It eases people into alignment with their own words. And this is where the paradox deepens. Those first yeses might not be profound, but they still shape the story a person tells about themselves. A string of simple agreements nudges someone into thinking, I'm supportive, I'm open, I'm on board. When the bigger yes comes, it feels like a continuation of that self-story. In psychology, this ties into what's called commitment and consistency. Once people commit, even in small ways, they want to remain consistent with that commitment. Breaking the pattern feels like breaking character. And because identity is such a powerful motivator, it becomes easier to say yes than to disrupt the flow with a no. What's even stranger is that sometimes the yes ladder can work even if the early questions have no logical connection to the final ask. Imagine agreeing that the sky is blue, that weekends are nice, that you like to relax, and then being asked to sign up for something. The logical chain isn't there, but the rhythm is. Agreement creates inertia, and inertia carries people forward. Of course, like any tool, the yes ladder can be misused. In the wrong hands, it becomes manipulation, an easy way to guide someone toward decisions they don't really want to make. But when used ethically, it's less about control and more about collaboration. You're not forcing agreement. You're building a shared framework, step by step, until the final decision feels mutual. That's why the best communicators, whether salespeople, teachers, or leaders, don't argue people into compliance. They invite agreement by beginning with common ground. They plant small yeses like stepping stones, then let people walk forward at their own pace. The power is not in the pitch itself, but in the sequence leading up to it. And this sequence is subtle. The questions aren't loud or dramatic. They're calm, almost invisible. But as they add up, they create a rhythm of agreement, and rhythm is hard to break. Think of music, you don't stop clapping along halfway through a beat. Once you're in the flow, you want to finish it. Saying yes works the same way. The yes ladder is proof that persuasion doesn't always come from big arguments or dramatic speeches. Sometimes it comes from a quiet series of small steps, each one so simple it's hard to resist, until the bigger decision feels inevitable. So the next time you want someone to agree, don't start with your destination. Start with the first step. Ask something obvious, something undeniable. Let them agree, then build, step by step, yes by yes. By the time they reach the top, their final agreement won't feel like something you persuaded them into. It will feel like something they chose all along. And that's the paradox. The easiest way to earn a big yes is to begin with the small ones that seemed meaningless. Because those little steps don't just lead somewhere, they create the path itself. The power of 3. Why less feels complete and more persuasive. The paradox of influence is that sometimes less persuades more, and nowhere is this clearer than in the strange dominance of the number 3. It's fascinating how the human brain is wired. We like closure, we like rhythm, and we like things that feel complete without feeling overwhelming. That's exactly why 3 works so well. Not 2, not 4, not 5, 3. Psychologists have studied memory for decades, and one consistent pattern is that people don't recall details in proportion to the truth of the information, they recall it in proportion to how it's presented. Structure often matters more than content, and 3 is the structure that sticks. Think of slogans you've heard countless times. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Stop, drop, and roll. Mind, body, spirit. No one sat down and wrote a scientific formula proving 3 is superior. It's simply that when words or ideas arrive in 3s, the brain unconsciously breathes out and says, "That feels finished." It's not logic, it's rhythm. 1 idea feels like a fragment. 2 feels like a pair but not a pattern. 3, however, signals balance, symmetry, and a subtle sense of inevitability. The mind loves patterns, and 3 is the smallest number that creates 1. If you want to persuade someone, you don't need to drown them in data. In fact, too much information can backfire. Imagine sitting through a presentation where someone gives you 7 reasons why their plan will work. By reason number 4, your attention drifts, and by number 6, you can't even recall the first point. But give the same plan 3 reasons, clearly defined and evenly paced, and suddenly it feels sharp, complete, and trustworthy. This is not because the reasons are objectively better, it's because the packaging makes them easier to absorb. The rule of 3 works like a psychological filter. It distills complexity into something people can handle, repeat, and carry with them long after the words have faded. I've noticed this not just in advertising or storytelling, but in everyday conversation. Let's say you want to make a strong point in a meeting. Instead of rambling or piling on every angle you can think of, say, "Here's what matters. First, we need clarity. Second, we need speed. And third, we need follow-through." That sentence isn't long, but it lands with weight. It feels bigger than it is because it's wrapped in a form the brain likes. The listener won't remember every word, but they'll remember that you laid out 3 strong pillars, and that memory makes you sound more confident, more thoughtful, and more persuasive than someone who spoke twice as long with twice as many points. Here's where it gets even stranger. 3 doesn't just make information easier to process, it makes it easier to trust. The human brain equates simplicity with truth. When something feels too complicated, we instinctively doubt it. But when it's presented in a clean, balanced package, we lean in. Politicians, advertisers, and leaders all exploit this. Fast, easy, reliable. Buy now, save money, live better. Even fairy tales and myths follow this rhythm. 3 little pigs, 3 wishes, 3 trials before the hero succeeds. It's not an accident, it's narrative engineering. Our minds have been trained since childhood to expect 3s, and so when we hear them, we relax into the pattern. But the paradox is this: giving fewer details often convinces more. That feels counterintuitive because we think persuasion requires proof, evidence, and lots of words. Yet the more information we pile on, the more mental work we demand from the other person. Too much detail is like an overloaded plate. It doesn't feel satisfying, it feels exhausting. 3 avoids that. It offers just enough to feel like you've said something substantial, but not so much that it feels like effort. And effort, in persuasion, is the enemy. People don't want to work hard to understand your point. They want it to feel obvious, almost effortless, and 3 delivers exactly that. I've tested this in real life. In one situation, I pitched a project idea using 5 carefully researched reasons why it should move forward. The response: polite nods, but no real momentum. Later, I reframed the exact same proposal into 3 simple points: clarity, cost savings, and impact. This time, the reaction was different. People leaned in, they remembered it, and they repeated those same 3 points later when explaining the idea to others. The content hadn't changed. The structure had, and structure beats substance in terms of memorability and persuasion. That's the rule of 3 at work, hiding in plain sight. What's even more fascinating is how 3 affects emotion. When you want to express yourself strongly, 1 word rarely does it justice. 2 sometimes feels flat. but 3 creates depth. Say, I'm disappointed. That communicates, but lightly. Say, I'm disappointed and frustrated. Stronger, but it still feels like something's missing. Now say, I'm disappointed, frustrated, and honestly let down. That third piece gives the sentence shape and resonance. It feels like a complete emotional picture. That's why even kids instinctively tell jokes in threes. The third beat makes it land. This principle explains why so many stories are structured in acts, beginning, middle, end. Too short, and the story feels like a sketch. Too long, and the audience loses focus. 3 acts are just enough to create a sense of journey, climax, and resolution. Our culture is built on the invisible rhythm of 3, from the music we sing to the speeches that inspire us. The funny thing is, we don't notice it consciously most of the time. We simply feel it, and that's why it's so powerful. The rule of 3 bypasses rational analysis and goes straight to intuition. It doesn't ask the mind to think, it asks it to recognize. Now, let's push deeper. Why does 3 resonate so strongly? One possible explanation comes from cognitive load theory. Our short-term memory has limits, and studies show that while it can hold around 7 items, in practice people comfortably retain far fewer at a time. 3 seems to hit the optimal point where information feels manageable but still meaningful. It's no coincidence that traffic rules, emergency instructions, and life-saving advice often come in 3s. The brain is already overloaded in those moments, so the simplest form is the most effective. But the lesson here isn't just about memory, it's about persuasion and influence. When you talk in 3s, you create the impression of being thorough without being overwhelming. You give just enough detail to establish credibility, but not so much that you lose attention. And most importantly, you give people something they can repeat. Because persuasion doesn't stop when you finish talking. The real test is whether the other person can carry your message forward to others. And people don't repeat long lists, they repeat 3s. That's why if you want your idea to spread, don't arm people with 10 points they'll forget. Arm them with 3 they can remember and repeat. In a world drowning in data, the ability to simplify is more powerful than the ability to add. 3s are your shortcut to being remembered, trusted, and repeated. They cut through noise. They make your words portable. And they create the illusion of completeness, which is often more persuasive than completeness itself. That's the paradox. Truth alone isn't enough. The form of truth, the rhythm of delivery, can matter more. And 3 is the form the mind trusts. So the next time you want to persuade, inspire, or simply be remembered, don't overwhelm. Don't dilute your message with too much. Shape it. Package it. Deliver it in 3s. Because 3 is the number that convinces without trying, the number that completes without clutter, the number that makes the brain feel at home. And when the brain feels at home, it believes. That's the hidden power of 3. Less isn't just more. Less is stronger, sharper, stickier. 3 is where persuasion lives. The illusion of choice. How to stay in control by letting others decide. The illusion of choice is one of the most underrated strategies of influence. On the surface, giving people options looks like surrendering control. After all, if you let them choose, they're the ones making the decision, right? But here's the paradox. When the choices are carefully designed, you're not giving up control, you're tightening it. The trick lies in shaping the frame. If you ask someone, "Do you want to do this?" you've handed them power over the outcome. They can simply say no, and the conversation ends. But if you ask, "Would you prefer this or that?" suddenly the dynamic changes. You've removed the option of refusal while still making them feel autonomous. They are choosing, but only between doors that you built, both leading to your intended destination. This technique is known as offering controlled choices, and it's surprisingly powerful because of how the human brain responds to autonomy. People hate being told what to do. It triggers resistance even if they agree with the task itself. But if the exact same task is framed as a choice, the resistance melts away. Why? Because ownership matters. When someone feels like they decided, their ego relaxes. They're not complying with you. They're fulfilling their own decision. And once people choose something, even if the choice was engineered, they defend it more strongly than if it had been imposed. You see this in parenting all the time. Tell a child, brush your teeth now, and you invite a power struggle. But say, do you want to brush your teeth now or in 5 minutes? And suddenly brushing happens with less drama. The difference is tiny in form but massive in effect. The child feels like they got to decide, and the act of brushing becomes less about obedience and more about agency. Adults aren't much different. Offer someone a rigid directive and they'll push back. Offer them 2 or 3 frame choices and they'll lean in. In business, this works brilliantly. Imagine you're closing a sale. If you ask, would you like to buy today? You've opened the door to rejection. But if you ask, would you like to start with the monthly plan or the yearly plan? You've already assumed the sale. Now you're only letting them decide the shape it takes. The psychology here is fascinating. By making a choice, even a small one, people become more committed to the path ahead. It's not just a transaction anymore. It's their transaction. The very act of choosing creates buy-in. And what people pick, they protect. But there's a boundary to this paradox. Too many choices ruin it. Research shows that excessive options overwhelm the brain, creating anxiety and hesitation. Offer 2 or 3 and people feel empowered. Offer 10 and they freeze. This is why successful marketers often present products in small, tiered bundles. Bronze, silver, gold, basic, pro, premium. The pattern is simple. Limit the range but make each choice feel meaningful. People don't notice that the frame was built by you. They only notice that they're steering within it. Here's where it gets deeper. The illusion of choice is not about manipulation, it's about harmony. People crave autonomy because autonomy signals respect. When someone feels respected, they engage more willingly. You can apply this in leadership by shifting from directives to options. Instead of saying, we need this report tomorrow, you could say, would you prefer to submit the report by the afternoon or by end of day? Both routes lead to your goal, but the framing feels collaborative, not commanding. The outcome is the same, but the path feels fairer, and fairness changes behavior. People don't resist what they feel they co-created. This principle even diffuses conflict. Suppose you're in an argument. Instead of demanding resolution, you could ask, would you prefer to take 10 minutes to cool off or talk it through right now? Both paths aim at resolution, but the simple act of choosing eases tension. It's no longer about winning or losing. It's about preference, and preference feels safe. The paradox is that by loosening your grip on control, you often end up with more control. Another layer worth mentioning is how this tactic interacts with commitment bias. Behavioral psychology tells us that once people make a small choice, they're more likely to follow through on larger commitments. By saying yes to a framed option, they unconsciously set a precedent for their future actions. This is why salespeople prefer asking, would you like me to call Thursday or Friday? Instead of, can I call you? Once you've chosen Thursday, you've already agreed to the follow-up. Your mind starts aligning your behavior with your choice, not the salesperson's request. It's not just a trick. It's a structural use of human psychology. And the beauty of this paradox is that it works almost everywhere. Parents, leaders, negotiators, and even therapists use controlled choices to guide without force. In relationships, it can soften delicate conversations. Instead of saying, we need to talk, you might say, would you rather talk about this tonight over dinner or tomorrow morning when we're fresh? Both scenarios create dialogue, but one feels imposed, while the other feels chosen. And when people feel like they chose, they enter the conversation less defensively. But let's not miss the deeper insight here. People don't need total freedom to feel free. In fact, total freedom can overwhelm. What people need is the sense that their voice matters. A narrow frame of choice can provide exactly that, a small pocket of autonomy inside a larger design. You, as the architect, decide the frame. They, as the participant, decide the color. The canvas is still yours, but the painting feels like theirs. Think about this in terms of influence. The strongest persuasion often doesn't come from pushing harder, it comes from guiding smarter. Controlled choice is one of those tools that flips the dynamic from confrontation to collaboration. It doesn't weaken your position, it strengthens it because it turns the other person into an active participant. And active participants are more loyal, more engaged, and more invested. So, the next time you want someone to do something, whether it's a child, a client, a colleague, or a partner, remember this paradox. Don't demand. Don't frame it as yes or no. Instead, offer 2 or 3 paths that all lead to the same goal. Do you want to start Monday or Wednesday? Do you want the simple version or the advanced version? Do you want to talk tonight or tomorrow? You've already set the destination. Now you're just letting them pick the vehicle. They'll feel independent, respected, and in charge, and yet you'll have guided the entire outcome. That's the hidden power of controlled choices. You stay in control precisely by letting others decide. The freedom paradox. Why letting people say no makes them say yes. The freedom paradox is one of those strange quirks of human psychology that flips our assumptions upside down. On the surface, telling someone they're free to refuse looks like weakness. You make a request, and then immediately soften it with, "But of course, it's your choice." It feels like you've taken the sharp edge off your ask, almost like you've surrendered authority. But that's exactly why it works. When people hear they're free to decide, their walls come down. Instead of feeling cornered, they feel respected, and respect changes everything. Our minds are wired to push back against pressure. Whenever we sense that someone is trying to control or trap us, our natural response is to resist, even if we wanted to agree in the first place. Think about the last time someone said, "You must do this," or "You have no choice." Chances are, some part of you bristled, even if the request was reasonable. That reaction isn't about the task, it's about autonomy. Humans crave freedom. We want to feel like our actions are ours. The moment you strip that away, resistance kicks in. The brilliance of the "but you are free" technique is that it removes the perception of force. You ask directly, but then you release control. And ironically, by letting go, you gain more influence. Let's make this concrete. Imagine you ask a friend, "Could you help me move this weekend?" Already, that sounds heavy. But if you add, "Of course, you're totally free to decide," the request transforms. The pressure vanishes. Suddenly, the choice belongs entirely to them. And here's the paradox, they're now more likely to say yes, not less. Why? Because the ask is no longer a demand, it's an invitation. People respond better to invitations than commands because invitations preserve dignity. This isn't just theory. Researchers have studied this exact phrasing and found that simply adding, "But you are free to decide," to a request significantly boosts compliance. The request itself doesn't change, the psychology does. Think about sales. A salesperson who says, "You really should buy this package today," triggers alarm bells. The buyer feels manipulated. But if the salesperson says, "I think this package is a great fit, but of course, it's your choice what feels right," the energy shifts. Now it feels like guidance, not pressure. And when people feel trusted to decide, they often align with your suggestion because it feels safer. Autonomy is soothing. It tells the brain, you are in control, and therefore you don't need to fight. This principle shows up in parenting too. A child asked, "Clean your room right now," may stomp and resist. But if the parent says, "I'd like you to clean your room today, but it's your choice when you do it," something shifts. The task hasn't disappeared, but the child feels a sense of agency. They're no longer following an order, they're choosing a responsibility. That little difference often determines whether the room gets cleaned with resentment or with surprising cooperation. The paradox is subtle, but its power lies in emotion. Requests framed with freedom feel lighter. They give people breathing space, and space creates willingness. Think about conflict resolution. Suppose you want confidentiality in a sensitive matter. If you say, "You must keep this secret," the listener feels constrained. But if you say, "I'd appreciate it if you kept this between us, but of course, it's up to you," you've shifted the dynamic. Now the response isn't about control, it's about trust. People rise to trust more often than they rise to commands because trust honors their independence. Another layer of insight here is about self-image. People want to feel that their actions align with their identity. When you pressure someone, their self-image rebels. "I'm not a puppet." But when you grant them freedom, they reconcile the request with their sense of self. I'm helping because I want to. And when people believe they're acting on their own terms, they follow through more fully. It's not just about getting a yes, it's about getting a yes that sticks. This also ties into the psychology of reactance, the instinct to do the opposite of what we're told when our freedom feels threatened. Every parent who said, "Don't touch that," knows the magnetic pull that command creates. But when the threat disappears, so does the urge to resist. The "but you are free" phrase is like a pressure valve. It releases the heat before resistance builds, leaving cooperation as the easier path. It's worth noting that this works even when people are aware of the technique. You could tell someone, "I know this sounds like psychology, but you're free to decide," and it still has power. Why? Because it's not about tricking anyone. It's about respecting the universal need for autonomy. Even if we know what's happening, we'd still rather be invited than forced. Respect never goes out of style. And here's the deeper paradox. Influence doesn't come from clinging tighter. It comes from loosening your grip. The more you try to control, the more resistance you invite. The more you allow freedom, the more people walk toward you willingly. This is true in leadership, sales, parenting, friendships, even romantic relationships. When you let people say no, they feel safe enough to say yes. Imagine applying this in negotiations. Instead of cornering someone with, "This is the only option," you say, "Here's what I propose, but of course, you're free to decide what works best for you." You've kept your position strong, but you've softened the delivery. Now the other person doesn't feel like they're giving in, they feel like they're choosing. And what people choose, they defend. They protect it, they commit to it, because it's theirs. At its core, this paradox reminds us that humans don't just want outcomes, they want ownership of outcomes. Even when the action is small, the feeling of choice magnifies commitment. That's why someone who agrees under pressure may later sabotage the task, but someone who agrees freely will often overdeliver. The emotional memory of freedom is powerful. People won't always remember the details of your request, but they'll remember how it felt. If it felt like a trap, they'll resent it. If it felt like freedom, they'll lean in. So next time you need something, whether it's a favor, a sale, or a simple request, try this paradox in action. Make your request clear, then let it breathe with, "But of course, you're free to decide." Say it calmly, without pleading, without manipulation, and then stop. Give space. Let the words do what pressure never could. People help more when they feel free to refuse, and that's the strange beauty of influence. When you let go of control, people hand it back to you not because they had to, but because they chose to. That's the paradox of freedom. The disappointment paradox. Why subtle disapproval inspires greater effort. The disappointment paradox is one of the strangest yet most effective psychological dynamics in human interaction. We're taught to think that people thrive on encouragement, that praise is the ultimate motivator, and that smiling approval is the surest way to bring out someone's best. And yes, encouragement has its place. But here's where human psychology takes an unexpected turn. Sometimes, a faint shadow of disappointment does more than a spotlight of praise ever could. When you quietly signal that you had higher expectations, without blame or anger, you activate something deeper than motivation, you awaken pride. People don't just want to be accepted, they want to be impressive. They want to feel they rose to the occasion, not merely coasted through it. When someone they respect subtly conveys, "I thought you could do better," it lands differently. It's not an insult, it's not punishment, it's a mirror. It reflects potential that wasn't fully realized. That reflection doesn't crush, it stirs. It makes a person ask, "Did I give my best? Could I have done more?" And when those questions come from within, the answers turn into action, because self-coaching is far more powerful than external pressure. This paradox works especially well when it's delicate. Too much disappointment becomes destructive. Too little is invisible. The sweet spot is a sigh, a pause, a silence that feels heavy without being cruel. A manager who says, "I thought we were closer to the target," and then says no more, speaks louder than one who rants for 20 minutes. The team feels the gap and wants to close it, not out of fear, but out of dignity. Because when disappointment is subtle, it's not about shame, it's about belief. If you didn't expect anything from someone, you wouldn't feel disappointed. Disappointment is proof of faith. It tells the other person, I know you're capable of more. And people want to live up to that belief. Think about relationships. If your partner lets you down and you don't yell, but you also don't smile it away, they feel the shift. The silence communicates, I expected differently. And if they care about you, that quiet moment pulls them forward. They reflect, they adjust, they try harder next time. Not to avoid punishment, but to restore balance, to re-earn the look of approval they value so much. It's not manipulation, it's an honest signal that you see more in them. That honesty, when delivered with calm restraint, drives deeper effort than hollow praise ever could. What makes this fascinating is how it reshapes the meaning of praise. A constant stream of approval eventually dulls. If every effort is amazing, then nothing is amazing. Praise without contrast loses weight. But if someone has felt your quiet disappointment, your approval later hits harder. They know they had to stretch to earn it. They remember the low, so the high lands with force. It's the emotional contrast, the journey between not quite meeting the mark and finally surpassing it, that creates real growth. In leadership, this paradox can transform teams. A leader who praises too much risks lowering standards. A leader who criticizes harshly destroys morale. But a leader who uses subtle disappointment sparingly, strategically, sets the bar high without breaking spirits. The message becomes, I believe in you enough to be unsatisfied with less. And that unsaid belief turns into fuel. The team doesn't just want to meet goals, they want to prove they can exceed them. They want the quiet nod of approval that only comes after the standard is truly met. Even in parenting, this paradox shows its power. Children don't always respond best to cheerleading or to scolding. Sometimes what moves them most is a calm sigh, a disappointed look, or a parent saying softly, I thought you had that one. The child feels both trusted and challenged. They don't crumble, they stretch. Because disappointment only stings when it comes from someone whose opinion matters. And when that opinion shows faith, the sting becomes inspiration. But this technique is dangerous if used carelessly. Too much disappointment becomes corrosive. If every effort is met with, not enough, people stop trying. They shut down, or they feel manipulated. The power lies in subtlety, in the unspoken. It's not about verbal attacks, it's about emotional contrast. A momentary dip in tone, a withheld smile, a pause before moving on, these are small but potent signals. They don't wound, they nudge. And because they're understated, they invite self-reflection instead of defensiveness. Here's the beauty of the paradox. People want to repair what feels slightly broken. A slight letdown triggers a need to restore equilibrium. If someone you respect sighs after you present your work, you'll likely revisit it, not because they demanded it, but because you feel compelled to fill the gap. And when you do, the improvement feels like your idea. It sticks longer, hits deeper, and elevates your sense of self. This is why some of the best coaches, mentors, and leaders use disappointment with surgical precision. They understand that a quiet, I thought you had that, can move a person further than 100 cheers. Because it places the responsibility inside the person. They don't want to let you down again, not because they fear punishment, but because they want to rise to the image you have of them. That image is aspirational. It pulls people upward. The paradox of disappointment also teaches us something about human pride. Praise strokes the ego, criticism wounds it. But subtle disappointment, it challenges pride without breaking it. It says, you're close, but not there yet. And for many people, that's irresistible. They want to cross the gap, to complete the unfinished arc. They don't settle until they've heard the quiet approval that says, yes, now you've done it. That moment of recognition feels earned, and earned pride is deeper than borrowed praise. Even in friendships, this plays out. A friend who always cheers you on may make you feel supported, but not stretched. A friend who occasionally looks at you with that hint of, I know you're better than this, can make you grow. They don't need to scold or shame. Just that subtle shift in tone is enough to light the fire inside you. Because deep down, we don't just want acceptance, we want to be seen as capable, impressive, worth believing in. And disappointment, when rooted in belief, unlocks the drive. So the next time someone falls short, Resist the urge to overpraise or overcriticize. Let the moment breathe. Show your disappointment not with anger, but with silence, with restraint, with calm. Let the weight of expectation speak louder than words. If they care, they'll feel it. If they respect you, they'll rise to it. And when they do, your eventual nod, your quiet approval, will mean more than 1,000 claps ever could. That's the paradox. By showing just enough disappointment, you don't break people, you build them. You remind them of who they could be. And that reminder pulls them forward with more power than praise alone. The peak end rule. Why we only remember the highs and the ending. People like to believe that memory works like a recording, a neat and faithful replay of every moment. But the truth is much stranger. Our brains are selective editors, trimming down hours or even years into just a few highlights and a closing scene. This is where something called the peak end rule comes in, and it flips the way we think about experiences. The rule is simple. We don't remember everything. We remember the emotional peak, the strongest moment, and how it all ended. That's it. The rest becomes filler that fades into the background. It sounds unfair, but this quirk of memory has enormous power over how we judge events, people, and even our own lives. Think about it. You can sit through a 2-hour movie that drags in the middle, but if it has one jaw-dropping scene and ends on a satisfying note, you'll walk out feeling like it was worth it. On the other hand, you can enjoy an evening that's smooth from start to near the end, but if the final moments are awkward or disappointing, the entire memory sours. The ending becomes the summary. The brain doesn't care about averages, it cares about spikes and closures. That's the paradox. We assume people will judge us or our work based on consistency, but they don't. They judge based on emotional punctuation, marks, the exclamation in the middle and the period at the end. The science behind this is compelling. Studies on pain, for example, reveal that patients undergoing medical procedures reported less overall discomfort when the procedure ended more gently, even if the total pain lasted longer. The brain edited the memory with more weight on the ending than the duration. This means a longer but kinder experience can be remembered more positively than a shorter, harsher one. It's not about the raw data. It's about the emotional imprint. This is why comedians often save their best joke for last, why performers close with their most popular song, why teachers end a lesson with something memorable instead of just fading out. They understand, consciously or not, that the final impression overrides the middle stretch. Now here's where it gets personal. If you want to craft experiences for others or even for yourself, you don't need to obsess over making every second flawless. That's impossible. What you need is one powerful peak and a thoughtful close. Imagine a friend visits you for the weekend. The middle might involve errands, delays, or boredom. But if one evening is filled with laughter and connection, and you send them off with warmth, that's what they'll remember. Or think about your own day. You might slog through work, deal with frustrations, and feel drained. But if you intentionally create a moment of joy, a favorite meal, a good conversation, or a few minutes of stillness, and then end the day with a ritual of calm, you'll look back and call it a good day. You didn't change the whole day. You changed its signature. The peak end rule also shapes relationships. A conversation might stumble, full of awkward pauses, but if you close it with sincerity, a smile, a kind word, that's what sticks. Conversely, a fight that drags on with no soft ending lingers in memory as harsher than it was. It's not just about what happens, but how it finishes. The closing note defines the story we tell ourselves afterward, and that story is what we carry forward, not the reality of the whole sequence. That's why arguments often feel bigger in hindsight. The ending wasn't repaired. And that's why reunions feel powerful. The emotional high overrides the dullness of long absence. There's another fascinating side to this paradox. Peaks and endings don't just shape how we remember, they shape whether we want to return. A vacation that had one unforgettable moment and a great closing dinner will lure us back, even if most of it was average. A work project that finished with applause will stick in memory as a success, even if the process was grueling. This is how memory deceives us. It compresses the complexity of experience into two weighted points. And because of that, the middle becomes irrelevant. We don't need to design perfect continuity. We need to design emotional anchors. But this also creates risk. If the peak is weak and the ending is flat, everything gets filed under meh. Imagine a restaurant with flawless service throughout but a disappointing dessert. That last bite can overshadow everything. Or a date that flows well but ends with distance instead of warmth. The story becomes negative, not because the whole thing was bad, but because the brain decided the ending defined the whole. And once memory decides, it's hard to argue with it. That's why leaders, performers, parents, and partners need to be conscious about how they close. The goodbye matters more than the middle stretch. What makes the peak end rule so powerful is how it applies universally. Entertainment, customer service, teaching, relationships, even personal habits. The principle is the same. People won't remember the entire path, they'll remember the emotional spike and the last step. That means a teacher can transform a tough lesson by ending with encouragement. A doctor can make a procedure feel less traumatic by offering comfort at the close. A business can turn a neutral transaction into a positive memory by finishing with gratitude. And each of us can reshape our own daily story by crafting an intentional close, no matter how chaotic the middle was. This isn't manipulation, it's understanding how memory works. We all want to believe that consistency is what matters most, but consistency doesn't stick in memory. Peaks and endings do. When we embrace that, we can create experiences that last longer in the minds of others and in our own. The paradox is that the brain isn't fair, but it is predictable. It forgets the average and amplifies the exceptional. It doesn't save every file. It saves the headline and the highlight reel. And if we know that, we can choose what headline we leave behind. So the next time you're hosting, teaching, leading, performing, or simply sharing a moment with someone you care about, don't worry if the middle is bumpy. Focus on one emotional spike and a strong close. Let the memory edit in your favor. And in your own life, build rituals that end your days, your weeks, your projects with closure that feels good. Because in the end, what defines experience isn't the whole, it's the high point and the ending. That's the peak end rule. That's the paradox. The middle fades, but the memory is sealed by the peaks and the farewells. The trust paradox. Why repeating their words builds deeper connection. We grow up thinking that trust is earned by being impressive, by giving great advice, showing intelligence, or dazzling people with our words. But here's the paradox. Trust often grows stronger when you talk less about yourself and more about them. Specifically, when you reflect their words back, not like a robot copying phrases, but as a mirror reshaping what they said in your own language. This simple act, called conversational mirroring, can feel so small it's almost invisible. Yet, it carries weight. When someone says, "I feel stuck lately," and you respond, "So you've been feeling like there's no clear way forward," it's not about adding insight. It's about giving their words back with care. And when people hear their own thoughts echoed, something powerful happens. They don't feel corrected, they don't feel judged, they feel understood. And understanding is the currency of connection. Most of us don't actually want constant advice when we share our thoughts. What we want is proof someone was listening, proof our words landed, and reflecting their words provides that proof instantly. That's why therapists, negotiators, and even great leaders lean on mirroring. It creates safety in the conversation. But here's where it gets interesting. The real reason it works isn't psychological trickery. It's neurological. When people hear their feelings or concerns acknowledged out loud, their brain calms. The limbic system, the part that sounds alarms when we feel dismissed, quietly lowers its guard. Reflection signals, your inner world has been noticed. And once that alarm softens, trust can flow. That's why someone who feels ignored might keep repeating themselves, louder each time, until someone reflects it back. The moment it's echoed, the tension often fades. It's not agreement they were chasing, it was recognition. This principle shows up everywhere. In business, a customer says, "I'm not sure this is worth it." Instead of launching into a hard sell, you could respond, "So what I'm hearing is you want to be sure this is a solid investment." Now the customer relaxes. They see you're not fighting their concern, you're validating it. That validation is what keeps the door open for real dialogue. In conflict, if someone says, I don't think you understand how stressful this has been. The worst move is to argue. But the best move is simple. It sounds like this has been heavier on you than I realized. That single line turns a wall into a window. They don't need you to fix it, yet they need you to see it. And being seen is often what dissolves the conflict itself. It's easy to underestimate how much humans crave this. We think people want clever answers or groundbreaking solutions. But time and again, what they really want is acknowledgement. Think of the last time someone truly reflected your words. Didn't it feel grounding, like they actually carried part of your experience with them? It's the opposite of being cut off or redirected. And because so few people actually listen this way, when it does happen, it feels memorable. You trust the listener not because they gave you wisdom, but because they gave you attention. That's the paradox. Being understood is often more valuable than being advised. Of course, mirroring only works when it's genuine. If you're half listening and mechanically repeating words, people sense the emptiness. Authentic mirroring requires presence. You can't reflect someone's thoughts well unless you've truly absorbed them. And when you do, reflection stops being a trick, it becomes a natural expression of care. This is why skilled therapists and negotiators don't parrot, they translate. They might say, "It seems like you feel overlooked," or, "So you're saying the pressure has been non-stop." Notice how those reflections don't copy, but capture the essence. The subtle rephrasing proves you processed their words instead of just storing them like a tape recorder. The effect of this is deeper than just good conversation. It rewires the way relationships feel. A friend who reflects your struggles becomes the one you call when life feels heavy. A manager who mirrors an employee's concerns builds loyalty that can't be forced through orders or incentives. Even in parenting, when a child says, "Nobody listens to me," a simple, "So you're feeling like your voice doesn't matter right now," can stop tears faster than any lecture. Why? Because the child no longer feels invisible. And invisibility is what fuels most emotional storms. There's also a counterintuitive benefit to mirroring in moments of disagreement. When tempers rise, our instinct is to defend. But defense escalates. Reflection, on the other hand, diffuses. Imagine someone says, "Your plan is unrealistic." If you respond, "So you feel like it's too risky in the current situation," the fire cools. You didn't agree, but you acknowledged their lens. That acknowledgement often makes them more willing to hear yours in return. People soften when they feel heard, not when they're told to calm down. And this applies even when stakes are high. In negotiations, FBI hostage negotiators famously use tactical empathy, a form of mirroring, to build trust with volatile people. Why? Because reflecting words cuts through chaos. It's one of the fastest ways to establish rapport in impossible situations. If it works there, it can certainly work in everyday conversations. The paradox is clear. The less you focus on sounding smart, the more people will trust your presence. Because trust doesn't come from dazzling words, it comes from reflective silence, from showing that someone's thoughts matter enough to echo back. And here's the deeper truth. Reflection doesn't just help them, it helps you. When you mirror someone's words, you slow your own impulses to react, argue, or dominate. You train yourself to hold space instead of filling it. And that space is where authentic connection grows. Think of it this way. Conversations are mirrors. In most, we try to polish our side so it looks impressive. But real connection happens when we turn the mirror toward them. When they see themselves clearly in your reflection, they feel safer with you. And safe is where trust lives. That's why the people we trust most aren't always the smartest or the funniest. They're the ones who made us feel heard without judgment. They didn't try to fix us, they held a mirror up so we could see ourselves. And in that moment, we trusted them more. So, the next time someone opens up to you, resist the urge to fill the air with solutions or stories. Instead, listen, then reflect. Say it back gently in your own words. Let them feel echoed, not overshadowed. Because trust doesn't come from controlling the conversation, it comes from creating a mirror inside it. That's the paradox of mirroring. By repeating less of yourself and more of them, you build the kind of trust people never forget. The hidden power of subtle touch. Why small gestures create lasting connections. There's something almost invisible that happens in human connection, a kind of silent language we rarely talk about but everyone has felt. It doesn't come in the form of eloquent words, long speeches, or clever arguments. It comes in something smaller, quieter, faster, a simple touch. Psychologists call this the subtle touch, and it carries a paradox that feels almost unfair in how effective it is. When used with care, a brief gesture, a tap on the arm, a light hand on the shoulder, or a gentle squeeze in the middle of a laugh can change how someone feels about you more than an entire conversation could. And here's what makes it strange. The less attention you draw to it, the more powerful it becomes. Think about it. If someone pauses a conversation and says, "Hey, I'm going to touch your shoulder now," the spell breaks. But when touch flows naturally inside the rhythm of interaction, it sneaks past the rational mind and lands directly in the body. That's why we respond so strongly to it, even without noticing. Our nervous system interprets it as, "You're safe, you're seen, we're connected." This isn't a modern invention. Long before humans had language, before stories or logic or philosophy, touch was communication. A parent holding a child's hand, a friend patting a shoulder, a partner brushing fingers against another's. These moments told us what words couldn't. And even now, in a world overflowing with digital messages, texts, and endless streams of content, nothing replaces that ancient signal of presence, the feeling of another human hand saying, "I'm here with you." What fascinates me is that people often don't consciously remember being touched. If you asked him afterward, they might not even mention it. But what they will recall is how the interaction felt: warmer, safer, more human. That's the paradox. The smallest physical gesture often leaves the biggest emotional footprint. You've probably experienced this without thinking. You're laughing with a friend, and in the middle of it, they lightly touch your arm. You don't stop and analyze it, you just feel more connected. Or maybe you were anxious about something, and someone briefly placed their hand on your shoulder as if to say, "I've got you." The words might fade, but the feeling sticks. Science backs this up. Studies show that appropriate, brief touch can increase trust, cooperation, and even agreement. A waiter who lightly touches a customer on the arm tends to receive higher tips. A teacher who gives a reassuring pat on a student's back creates more engagement. A handshake held a second longer than usual makes negotiations smoother. The reason isn't magic, it's biology. Touch releases oxytocin, lowers stress responses, and tells the body, "You're not alone." But here's the important part: it only works when it's subtle, natural, and respectful. If it feels forced, exaggerated, or manipulative, it backfires. A prolonged, awkward touch doesn't create warmth, it creates discomfort. So the power lies not in how much you do it but in how little. The smaller the touch, the bigger the impact. The paradox is that by doing almost nothing, you achieve almost everything. I've thought a lot about why subtle touch feels so powerful. One reason is presence. In a world where so many people are distracted, half listening, checking their phone, multitasking, a small touch signals undivided attention. It says, "I'm here in this moment with you." And presence, more than eloquence, is what people crave. Another reason is emotional anchoring. We often don't remember the exact words said to us, but we do remember the emotional flavor of a moment. A touch acts like a bookmark in memory, anchoring that interaction as warmer, kinder, more meaningful. That's why even when conversations are ordinary, people walk away with an extraordinary impression. But let me be clear, this isn't about tricking people. A touch only works if it's genuine, if it matches the energy of the moment. You don't reach out to impress someone, you reach out to connect. You don't use it as a tactic, you use it as a reminder, "I see you." When it comes from authenticity, it resonates deeply. When it comes from strategy, people sense the falseness instantly. The power of subtle touch extends to every kind of relationship. In personal life, a parent's gentle hand on their child's back during a hard moment can create lasting feelings of safety. In romantic life, small gestures often mean more than grand speeches. In professional settings, used appropriately, it can soften formality and create rapport. A firm handshake with a brief touch on the forearm can say more about sincerity than 100 rehearsed words. But what I find most striking is how the paradox works in emotionally charged situations. When someone is upset, logic doesn't usually calm him down. Words often bounce off, but a brief, appropriate touch can cut through the noise and communicate care in a way language can't. A hand on the shoulder during grief, a tap on the arm when someone feels invisible, a quick squeeze when words aren't enough. These moments can matter more than speeches. And the irony is that the person receiving it might not consciously register the gesture. They might not say, "Oh, you touched me at exactly the right time." What they will feel is, that moment was comforting. That person cared. The message is absorbed without analysis. That's why this paradox fascinates me. The most forgettable action creates the most unforgettable emotion. Even in disagreements, this holds true. Imagine a heated debate. Voices rise, tension grows. Then, instead of pushing harder with words, you offer a brief physical acknowledgement, a calming touch that slows the rhythm. Suddenly, the emotional temperature shifts. You didn't compromise your stance, but you transformed the tone. The nervous system doesn't care about winning arguments. It cares about safety. And touch signals safety faster than logic ever could. Of course, boundaries matter. Cultural norms, personal comfort levels, and context all play a role. What feels natural to one person may feel invasive to another. That's why the rule of subtle touch is respect. Light, brief, situationally appropriate, and never forced. Its power comes precisely because it's not about you, it's about them. That's another paradox. You're the one initiating the touch, but they're the one who receives the benefit. Yet they're body links that benefit back to you. They feel calmer, warmer, more trusting, and their brain says, it must be because of this person. That association lingers long after the touch itself fades. So if you want to leave a lasting impression, don't think you need endless cleverness, flawless conversations, or dramatic gestures. Sometimes, it's about the opposite. Do less, speak less, touch light, let the smallest gesture do what the biggest performance cannot. And perhaps the most beautiful part is that this isn't just about how others see you, it's about how you shape your own memories too. Just as we remember days not by every detail, but by the peak and the ending, we also remember people not by every word, but by how they made us feel. And the subtle touch, those tiny, almost invisible seconds, can become the thread that stitches a moment into permanence. That's the paradox. In a world overflowing with noise, it's the quietest signals that last the longest. The echo and the silence gap, two hidden powers of conversation. Conversations often feel like a contest of who can say the smartest thing, but real influence doesn't always come from clever words. Sometimes, it comes from techniques so simple they almost feel like cheating. Two of the most underrated conversational tools are what I call the echo and the silence gap. They sound easy, almost too easy, but they can transform how people respond to you if you understand their deeper psychology. Let's start with the echo. Imagine someone says, "I've been really stressed out lately." Most people would respond with advice or reassurance, but the echo technique flips the script. Instead of offering your own perspective, you simply mirror back the last few words, "stressed out lately." Suddenly, the other person feels compelled to expand. They might say, "Yeah, mostly because work has been overwhelming. Deadlines keep piling up." If you reflect again, deadlines piling up, they'll go further, explaining things they might not have told anyone unprompted. What makes this work is not magic but neuroscience. When people hear their own words reflected back, their brain interprets it as validation. It's like holding up a mirror to their inner world, and that reflection makes them feel recognized without judgment. This instantly lowers defenses, because most of us aren't used to being listened to so closely. We're used to being interrupted, advised, or talked over. But when someone echoes, we feel not just heard, but deeply understood. Used ethically, this is a beautiful way to build intimacy and trust. It works in friendships, relationships, therapy, and even business. A client who says, "I'm not sure this is worth the price," and hears back, "not worth the price," will often go on to explain their real concerns: budget, trust, priorities. You didn't push them, you simply let them reveal themselves. But like any powerful tool, it can be abused. If you overuse the echo, it starts to sound manipulative, like a trick instead of a connection. The key is moderation. You don't need to repeat every sentence, only every few exchanges. Adjust your tone to sound curious rather than robotic. Keep your body language soft, your eye contact steady, and let your reflection feel like natural empathy instead of strategy. When done right, people walk away from the conversation thinking you're a great conversationalist, even though most of the time you only echoed their own words. That's the paradox. You become memorable not because of what you said, but because of how you listened. Now, the second tool is the silence gap. If the echo is about giving people space to expand, silence is about holding that space open longer than they expect. Humans are uncomfortable with silence. In conversation, even a few seconds of pause feels heavy. Most people rush to fill it with words, often revealing more than they intended. That's why silence, when used deliberately, is such a powerful force. Imagine you ask someone, "What's been bothering you lately?" And instead of jumping in with another question, you wait. 3 seconds. 5. 10. That silence creates a pressure most people can't resist. They start to fill it, often with more honest answers than they planned. They might confess frustrations, doubts, or fears, simply because the quiet made them confront what was bubbling under the surface. In negotiations, this is even more striking. You make an offer and then say nothing. The silence grows, the other side fidgets, and suddenly they start negotiating against themselves, lowering their price, sweetening their terms, just to break the tension. It's persuasion without a single extra word. It's control without effort. The human brain craves closure, and silence leaves the door open. People rush to close it themselves. But silence, like the echo, only works when you're comfortable with it. Most people can't stand more than 3 seconds of quiet. They laugh nervously, change the subject, or jump in with chatter. If you can push past that discomfort, holding 5, 7, even 10 seconds, you gain an invisible advantage. You're not forcing the other person. You're simply letting their own discomfort do the work. And here's what makes silence even more interesting: it doesn't just pull out hidden truths. It also communicates confidence. Someone who can sit calmly in silence appears stronger, steadier, more in control. It signals presence, patience, and self-assurance. Think about great leaders or negotiators. They rarely rush their words. They let pauses hang. They let silence speak. And that quietness commands more respect than frantic speech ever could. The echo and the silence gap are two sides of the same coin. The echo shows people you're listening. Silence shows them you're not afraid. Combined, they create an atmosphere where people open up to you without resistance. You don't need to manipulate. You don't need to dominate. You simply listen more than you speak and hold space longer than they expect. And in that space, they reveal themselves. But like all tools of influence, the ethical line matters. These techniques should never be used to trap or exploit people. They're not about getting secrets or winning arguments at someone else's expense. They're about creating trust, connection, and honesty. If you use them manipulatively, people eventually feel it. If you use them genuinely, they'll remember you as the rare person who actually heard them. Think about the conversations you remember most in your life. Chances are, they weren't the ones where someone dazzled you with brilliant arguments. They were the ones where you felt truly seen, where you spoke freely, where silence gave you the space to share what mattered. That's what the echo and silence offer. They're reminders that the most powerful part of conversation isn't always what you say, it's what you don't. It's the tiny reflection that tells someone, "I get you," and the long pause that tells them, "I'm here until you're ready." In a world full of noise, those moments of echo and silence are the ones people crave, because they create what's most rare: genuine human connection. That's the paradox. You don't need the perfect words. Sometimes, you just need to reflect theirs. Sometimes, you just need to wait. Mind games: how false choices, confessions, and silence secretly control conversations. People often believe they are in control of their decisions, conversations, and emotions, but subtle techniques reveal just how fragile that control really is. Take the false choice trap, for example. On the surface it feels like freedom, but in reality, It's the art of narrowing a person's options without them noticing. Instead of asking someone if they want to meet, you ask whether they prefer Tuesday or Thursday. The no was never an option, yet the other person walks away feeling empowered because they got to pick. What's fascinating is that this strategy doesn't prey on ignorance but on pride. The more independent or strong-willed a person is, the more effective it becomes, because they're desperate to protect the illusion of autonomy. You'll see parents use it with children, managers with employees, salespeople with customers. It shows up everywhere. And while it seems harmless, it has an unsettling edge. Because once you realize how easily people can be steered without realizing it, you see how fragile our sense of control really is. The danger, of course, is overusing it. People eventually notice the pattern, and then what felt like freedom begins to taste like manipulation. At that point, the trust is gone. The genius is in the balance guiding choices without ever making someone feel cornered. Now consider the confession mirror, which operates on a very different but equally powerful axis. Humans are wired for reciprocity. When someone gives us a gift, we feel compelled to give something back. The same rule applies in emotional exchanges. If I tell you something small but vulnerable, like admitting that social gatherings secretly make me anxious, you suddenly feel the urge to match that disclosure. Maybe you confess that parties drain you too, or that you hate speaking in meetings, or that you feel like an outsider in your own group of friends. This is not manipulation in the overt sense. It's more like triggering an instinct that has been wired into human psychology for survival. Shared vulnerability creates safety. But here's the catch. It can be exploited. A therapist may use it to open a door for healing, while a con artist may use it to create a false sense of intimacy. The person who mirrors the confession often feels bonded more strongly than the one who initiated it, creating a paradox of closeness. It's almost as though the confession doesn't just bounce back, it multiplies. Used ethically, this technique can deepen relationships, but in the wrong hands, it can leave someone exposed in ways they never intended. Then we have silence, perhaps the most underestimated tool of all. Most people are uncomfortable with quiet. In conversation, silence feels like a void that demands to be filled, and our brains scramble to resolve the tension it creates. Imagine asking someone a direct question like, "What aren't you telling me?" and then resisting every urge to soften the blow. You don't add a follow-up. You don't rescue them with small talk. You just wait. Within seconds, the discomfort builds. And eventually, more often than not, the other person starts talking. They may reveal details they intended to hide or negotiate against themselves in a deal, just to escape the weight of the silence. In negotiations, silence becomes a weapon of patience. While one side fidgets and lowers their demands, the other sits still, holding the quiet like a blade. The magic here is that silence doesn't push, it pulls. It doesn't force compliance, it invites surrender. And the longer you can tolerate the tension, the more powerful you become in that moment. What ties these three strategies together, the false choice, the confession mirror, and the silence gap, is that they all work by exploiting natural tendencies. People crave autonomy, so narrowing options feels like empowerment. People crave reciprocity, so a confession sparks another confession. People crave resolution, so silence pulls words out of them. None of these tricks require aggression. They don't rely on shouting or demanding or dominating. Instead, they leverage the very instincts that make us human. That's why they're so effective and so dangerous. The scary part is how invisible they are when used well. A false choice feels like freedom, not control. A mirrored confession feels like bonding, not probing. Silence feels like awkwardness, not influence. You rarely see the strings until after the dance is over. So the ethical dilemma is clear. Do we use these techniques for genuine connection, or do we weaponize them for manipulation? A parent might use a false choice to guide a child without conflict. A therapist might use the confession mirror to create trust. A negotiator might use silence to uncover the truth. But the same tools in the wrong hands can make people agree to things they didn't want, share secrets they never meant to, or surrender ground they could have held. Power, after all, is neutral. It's the intent behind it that defines whether it heals or harms. And if we're honest, Every one of us has been both the wielder and the target of these subtle games. Maybe you've asked your partner, "Do you want to eat in or go out?" knowing full well that staying in is the only real option. Maybe you've confessed something small to a friend, not realizing you were inviting them to go deeper than they wanted to. Maybe you've sat in silence during an argument until the other person cracked, thinking it was their choice to speak when it was your patience that forced their hand. Understanding these dynamics doesn't make you manipulative, it makes you aware. Because awareness is the first step to freedom. Once you see the mechanics of influence, you can decide when to use them, when to resist them, and when to call them out. The false choice is only a trap if you don't see the missing option. The confession mirror is only dangerous if you don't realize why you feel compelled to share. Silence is only powerful if you're afraid of it. By learning these tools, you gain the ability to navigate conversations with clarity instead of blindly reacting. And perhaps the biggest paradox of all is this: the more you understand how influence works, the harder it becomes for others to use it against you. Because when you recognize the game, you stop playing by someone else's rules.